There are two kinds of hay in the world. There is cattle hay, the kind that fills barns across the Midwest in loose, forgettable stacks, baled at whatever moisture the weather allows, stored in sheds or piled outside under tarps that sag with rainwater and flap in the November wind like tired surrender flags, fed to animals that will eat anything green or brown that does not have thorns. Cattle hay is a commodity. It is sold by the ton. The buyer does not open a bale and smell it. The buyer does not check the leaf retention or run a stem between his fingers to test whether it bends or snaps. The buyer does not care whether the hay was cut at boot stage or full bloom or somewhere lazy in between. The buyer weighs it. He pays the going rate, $80 to $120 per ton, and he drives away without looking back. He does not think about that hay again until the next load needs buying, and when he buys the next load, he does not think about it either. Cattle hay is background noise. It exists the way gravel exists on a road, functional, interchangeable, and utterly without distinction. Then there is horse hay. And horse hay is a different animal entirely. Horse hay is not a commodity. Horse hay is a craft product. It is judged by color. Bright green means properly cured. The chlorophyll preserved the nutrients locked in the plant, arrested at the peak of its vitality, and held there by a drying process so precise that the green does not fade. Golden means sun-bleached, left too long in the field, exposed to ultraviolet light that breaks down the pigments and the vitamins and leaves behind a pale imitation of what the hay was supposed to be. Brown means rain damaged or mold, the worst outcome, the hay equivalent of a house fire, the product ruined by the one thing no farmer can control and every farmer must anticipate. Horse hay is judged by leaf retention. The leaves are where the nutrition lives. Protein, energy, minerals. The digestible fiber that keeps a horse's gut healthy and its body fueled for the work that horses do running. Jumping, pulling, carrying, competing at levels that demand peak physical condition, sustained over years. Hay that has been over-dried or roughly handled sheds its leaves and becomes nothing but stems and broken promises. Stems are structure. Leaves are nutrition. A bale of stems is a bale of empty calories, and a horse worth $40,000 deserves better than empty calories. Horse hay is judged by smell. Good horse hay smells like summer. Sweet and clean and alive, with a fragrance that fills a barn the way sunlight fills a window, completely, warmly, unmistakably. No mustiness, which means mold. No ammonia, which means bacterial decomposition. No dust, which means overdrying or mechanical damage or storage failure or all three at once. The smell of good horse hay is the smell of a process done right from the first cut of the mower to the last bale placed in the barn, and anyone who has ever stood in a barn full of properly cured hay knows that smell the way a baker knows the smell of bread that came out of the oven at exactly the right moment. It is not a smell you forget. It is a smell that changes what you expect from every bale you open for the rest of your life. Horse hay is judged by texture. Soft, flexible stems that horses chew willingly versus brittle, sharp stems that they pick through and waste, tossing the rejected stems out of the feeder with a shake of the head that every horse owner recognizes as disapproval. And horse hay is judged by what is not in it. No mold spores, no weeds, no blister beetles which contain cantharidin and can kill a horse that ingests even a few. No foreign material, no wire, no plastic, no stones, no anything that does not belong in the digestive system of an animal that costs more than most people's cars and that trusts its owner to put something safe and nourishing in front of it every morning and every evening for the 20 or 30 years of its life. A bale of cattle hay sells for $4 to $6. A bale of premium horse hay sells for $8 to $18. The same field, the same grass, the same season, the same sun and the same rain in the same soil producing the same plant on the same acre of ground. The difference between $4 and $18 is how the hay was cut, how it was dried, how it was baled, and how it was stored. The difference is the curing. And the curing is the difference between a farmer who makes hay and a farmer who makes something worth paying for. In the fall of 1998, a woman named Audrey Fenwick stood in the doorway of her barn outside Albany, Missouri, and watched a man named Hank Dobbins tell her that her hay was worth $3.50 a bale. She had 2,000 bales of Timothy hay in that barn. She had cut every stem herself, tedded every windrow herself, raked and baled, and stacked every bale herself on 160 acres of pure timothy that she maintained the way a cathedral is maintained, with reverence, with discipline, and with the understanding that what she was preserving was worth more than what the world was willing to pay for it. Audrey Fenwick was 62 years old that autumn. She had been making hay since she was 14, when her father Russell had put a rake handle in her hands and walked her to the field and shown her how the hay lay in the windrow after the mower passed. The way the stems fell over one another, the way the leaves curled as the moisture left them, the way the color changed hour by hour, from the dark green of living grass to the lighter green of dying grass to the bright clean green of grass that had died at exactly the right speed and in exactly the right way. Russell had not called it dying, he had called it curing, because curing was not death, curing was transformation. The grass became hay, the moisture became stability, the green became permanent, and the field became money if you knew what you were doing, and if you did every step right, and if you did not cut corners or rush the process or let the weather beat you or let the market tell you that your work was not worth what you knew it was worth. 48 years of cutting, tedding, raking, baling, and storing grass on land that Russell had cleared and seeded with Timothy in 1968. 30 years of a pure stand. No weeds. Audrey had mowed the Timothy field borders twice a season to prevent weed seed from encroaching, walking the perimeter with a push mower in June and again in August, 3 miles of fence line that took a full day each time, her boots wet with dew in the morning and dry with dust by noon. No mixed species. The Timothy had been maintained by overseeding every third year with certified seed that Audrey ordered from a supplier in Wisconsin. The same variety, the same genetics, the same plant that Russell had chosen 3 decades earlier because it was fine-stemmed and leafy and cured well in the Missouri climate. No synthetic fertilizer, only composted cattle manure from her 40-head cow herd, applied in October after the last cutting at a rate of 2 tons per acre, spread with a manure spreader that Gerald had bought in 1979, and that still worked because Audrey replaced the beater chains every 5 years and greased the bearings every spring and never asked the machine to do more than it was designed to do. She had been alone on the farm for 12 years. Her husband Gerald had died in 1986, a heart attack at 51. He had been in the field that afternoon, walking the second cutting, checking the windrows for dew before the evening bale. The August heat was heavy and still the kind of heat that sits on northwest Missouri like a hand pressing down, and Gerald had been working since 5 in the morning, cutting, tedding, raking, waiting, testing, moisture baling the first field, moving to the second. He was a strong man. He was a careful man. He was a man who ate breakfast every morning and drank water all day and never complained about the work because the work was what he had chosen and what he loved and what he believed in, the way some men believe in God and some men believe in money, and Gerald believed in the hay. He fell face down in the second cutting while checking a windrow for dew. The hay was underneath him when Audrey found him, the sweet green stems pressed against his cheek, the moisture probe still in his hand. The reading on the probe was 14.2. The hay was ready. Gerald was not. The neighbors had assumed she would sell. A woman alone on 160 acres, no hired hand, no partner, no son, old enough to help no one, to lift the bales or fix the machinery when it broke in the middle of a cutting, which machinery always does, because machinery knows when you are alone, and it knows when you are tired, and it breaks at the intersection of those two things every single time. They assumed she would take the money from the land and the cattle and the equipment, and she would move to town, and she would live quietly in a house with a garden and a mailbox and no barn, and the hay would be someone else's problem. They assumed wrong. Audrey did not sell. She did what Gerald would have done. She finished the second cutting that week. She baled it at 14%, the reading still on the probe from Gerald's last measurement, the number that he had confirmed with his life and that she would honor with hers. She stacked it in the barn by evening, every bale off the field, before dark. Wait, Gerald had always done, the way Russell had taught them both. And she never missed a season after that. 12 years of doing every step alone, including the steps that Gerald used to do, including the steps that made her back ache at the end of the day, and her hands crack at the knuckles in the winter, and her knees creak when she climbed the stack to place the top row, 6 bales high, 12 feet off the barn floor, where the air was warmer, and the light came through the sidewall openings in bars of gold and dust, and the world below looked like a grid of twine and green. She did not complain. She did not ask for help. She did not accept the quiet pity of the neighbors who watched her work and shook their heads and said it was a shame a woman her age all alone out there with nothing but grass and cattle and a barn that needed a new roof and a tractor that was older than her son. The grass was not nothing, the grass was everything, and the way she cured it was the reason that a man named Hank Dobbins was standing in her barn that September morning looking at the best Timothy hay in northwest Missouri and calling it a number. $3.50. Hank Dobbins bought hay for a cattle feedlot in Nottoway County. Bulk hay by the ton. No premium, no fuss, no conversation about quality or craft or the difference between a bale that was cured right and a bale that was cured at all. He drove to farms. He looked at the stack. He offered a price. He hauled. He had been doing this for 20 years, and in 20 years, he had never once opened a bale and held it to his face and breathed. He had never once checked the leaf retention or asked about the cutting stage or tested the moisture with a probe. He measured bales the way a shipping clerk measures packages by season weight and quantity, the external dimensions that told him nothing about what was inside because what was inside did not matter to his customers and therefore did not matter to him. He looked at Audrey's hay that morning the way he looked at every farmer's hay. He pulled a bale from the stack. He cut the twine with a pocket knife that he had carried for 15 years and sharpened every Sunday and used for nothing except cutting bale twine, which meant the blade was perfect for the one task it performed and useless for everything else, which was in its own way a metaphor for Hank himself. He opened the bale. The hay was green, not the dull green of hay that had been baled too late or stored too long or rained on once or twice before the farmer gave up and baled it anyway. This green was bright, rich, deep, the kind of green that only happens when Timothy is cut at the right moment and dried at the right speed and stored at the right moisture in the right barn with the right airflow. The kind of green that horse people call the color of money, because it is the color of hay that is worth money, real money. Not the commodity price that Hank was about to offer, but the premium price that the hay deserved and that Hank would never understand. The leaves were intact, full and soft, clinging to the stems the way they clung in the field, preserved by a drying process so gentle that the leaves never overdried and never shattered and never fell away from the stems to accumulate as powder in the bottom of the bale. The stems were flexible. Audrey could bend them without breaking them, a test she performed on every 10th bale in every stack, because a flexible stem meant the hay was alive in the way that good hay is alive, not biologically but structurally, the plant material still holding its shape and its nutrition and its promise. There was no dust when Hank shook a flake over his hand. He shook it casually, the way a man shakes a newspaper to straighten the pages without paying attention to what falls out. Nothing fell out, no leaf fragments, no mold spores, no broken stems. The flake held together a clean rectangle of interlocked leaves and stems that separated from the bale, the way a slice separates from a loaf of well-made bread, cleanly, completely, with a structure that held. The smell filled the barn, sweet and clean and alive, like a July afternoon trapped in dry grass, like the memory of every good day the field had ever known, compressed into a fragrance that rose from the open bale and spread through the barn and drifted out the door and into the September morning, where it mixed with the smell of dew on the gravel and the diesel from Hank's truck and the faint distant smell of cattle from the 40-head herd in the pasture beyond the hayfield. Hank did not notice the smell. He did not notice the color or the leaves or the stems or the density or the flakes. He noticed the bale size, small, square, approximately 45 pounds. He noticed the stack, 2,000 bales in a barn stacked 6 high, covered, dry. He noticed the numbers. 2,000 bales at 45 pounds each was 90,000 pounds, which was 45 tons, which at market rate was somewhere between $3,150 and $3,600, depending on which price per ton he could negotiate. He made his offer. $350 a bale. I will take all 2,000. Cash. Audrey looked at him. She had known Hank for 15 years. She had watched him buy hay from every farm in Gentry County and most of the farms in Nottoway and Worth and Harrison counties too. Always the same offer within $1, always the same flat voice, Always the same assumption that hay was hay, and the price was the price, and the farmer's job was to accept what the buyer was willing to pay. 350 is $70 a ton. Market rate for grass hay around here. This is not grass hay. This is Timothy. Pure stand, no weeds. Cut at late boot stage, tedded, twice raked, once baled at 14% moisture, and stored inside within 4 hours of baling. This hay is horse quality. Horse quality. Hank's mouth made a shape that was not quite a smile and not quite a smirk, but somewhere in the territory between the two, the expression of a man who has heard something that he considers both incorrect and amusing. It looks like hay to me. It looks like hay to you because you feed cattle. If you fed horses, you would know what you are looking at. This hay would bring $12 to $15 a bale at a horse farm. The protein is 12 to 14%. The moisture is under 14. The leaf retention is above 90%. The dust count is negligible. This is not cattle hay, Hank. This is a craft product, and it is priced accordingly. Hank closed the bale. He did not retie the twine. He just dropped it back on the stack open the way a man drops something he has already decided is not worth holding. The flakes shifted when the bale landed, and one of them slid sideways and fell to the barn floor, a rectangle of perfectly cured Timothy lying in the dust at Hank's feet, and he did not pick it up, and he did not step around it. He stepped on it. There are not any horse farms in Gentry County, Audrey. There are horse farms in Lexington, Kentucky, 200 miles from here, and they pay triple for hay like this because they cannot get it from their local growers. You are going to sell small square bales of Timothy to Kentucky horse farms. From Missouri, I am going to sell the best cured Timothy in the Midwest to people who know what it is worth. You do not know what it is worth, Hank. That is not the hay's problem. That is yours. Hank Dobbins drove away. He did not argue. He did not counteroffer. He did not come back the next week with a better number or a different approach or a concession that might have met Audrey halfway. He simply drove away down the gravel road that ran past the Fenwick farm, past the white barn, with the green roof that Russell Fenwick had built in 1971, with lumber from the sawmill in Bethany and nails from the hardware store in Albany. In his own two hands, in the hands of three neighbors who had come to help because that was what neighbors did in Gentry County. In 1971 they helped, and the barn they built was still standing 27 years later because they had built it the way Russell built everything, carefully, solidly, with the expectation that it would outlast the man who made it. Past the hay elevator leaning against the south wall, past the mailbox at the end of the lane with the name Fenwick painted in Gerald's steady hand, the letters white on a black box, the paint faded now, but still legible after 26 years, because Gerald had used exterior enamel and 2 coats and had let the first coat dry completely before applying the second, the way he did everything once correctly, with no need to do it again. But Hank did not just drive away in silence. He drove to the next farm, and the farm after that, and the elevator in town, and the feed store on the county road, and everywhere he went he said the same thing. The Fenwick woman thinks her hay is worth gold. She turned down $350 cash for 2,000 bales of grass. She says it is horse quality. She says Kentucky farms will pay triple. He shook his head when he said it the way a man shakes his head about something that is both sad and amusing, and that confirms everything he already believed about a woman alone on a farm, and every farmer who heard it shook their head the same way. And for the rest of that month, Audrey Fenwick was the woman in Gentry County who was too proud to take a fair price for hay. No one else came to buy. The 2,000 bales sat in the barn. October arrived. The leaves turned on the oaks along the creek red and gold against the gray sky, and the Timothy field went dormant, the stubble from the second cutting lying flat and brown in the autumn rain. November arrived. The first frost whitened the pasture grass, and the cattle began eating hay from the smaller stack that Audrey kept, for her own herd cattle hay baled at 16%, stored outside under a tarp, acceptable for cows that did not care about color or leaf retention or smell. The cattle ate it without enthusiasm or complaint, the way cattle eat everything as fuel rather than food. The property tax notice came. The insurance premium came. The feed bill for the 40 head of cattle came, mineral supplements, veterinary costs, the winter hay that the cattle consumed at the rate of 30 pounds per head per day, which was 1,200 pounds per day for the herd, which was 18 tons per month, which was a number that added up faster than the bank balance could keep pace with. The loan payment on the tractor, a 1983 Farmall 560 that Gerald had bought, used from a retiring farmer in DeKalb County, and that Audrey had maintained for 15 years, with new points and plugs every spring, and a complete hydraulic rebuild in '92, and a paint job that she had done herself one summer, brush painted in the original red because she could not afford a spray gun, and because Gerald had liked the original red, and because the tractor deserved to look like what it was, which was a working machine that had earned its keep. The loan payment came due in December. Audrey sat at the kitchen table with the bills spread in front of her. The table was oak bought at an auction in Stanberry in 1974, the same auction where Gerald had bought the manure spreader. The bills covered the surface like fallen leaves, white envelopes, yellow invoices, the blue statement from the Gentry County Savings Bank, showing a balance of $611.42, 2,000 bales in the barn. At $350 each, that was $7,000, enough to cover the loan payment and the insurance and most of the feed bill. $7,000 sitting in the barn waiting for a buyer she had sent away because the price was wrong. Not wrong for the market, wrong for the hay, wrong for the 48 years of knowledge that had gone into every bale, wrong for the 7 steps that turned grass into something that smelled like summer and looked like money and fed horses that were worth more than the farm itself. The price was wrong the way a lie is wrong, factually incorrect, morally insufficient, and an insult to the truth of the thing being measured. She did not call Hank back. 3 weeks later, her son Nathan drove up the lane in a rented sedan. Nathan was 38, an insurance adjuster in Kansas City, a man who had left the farm at 18 and never looked back with anything other than the mild, distant fondness that people feel for places they have outgrown. He wore pressed khakis and a polo shirt with the logo of his company on the breast and shoes that would not survive the barn floor. He had not been home since Gerald's anniversary in September, when he had driven up for the day and stood at the grave in the Albany cemetery and said the things that sons say at their father's graves, things about missing him, things about wishing he were here, things that were true in the abstract, but that did not translate into action because Nathan's life was in Kansas City and his work was in Kansas City and his children were in Kansas City and the farm was a place he visited, not a place he lived. He sat at the same kitchen table and looked at the same bills and said what Audrey had known he would say from the moment she heard his tires on the gravel. Mom, there is a development company buying agricultural land west of here. Residential lots. They are paying $1,400 an acre for tillable ground. 160 acres, that is $224,000. You could retire. You could move to Kansas City near me and the kids. You could stop doing this. Stop doing what? This. Nathan gestured at the window at the barn, at the fields beyond, at the entirety of the life that Audrey had built and maintained and defended for 62 years. Breaking your back alone on a hay farm that cannot pay its own bills. You are 62 years old, Mom. You are stacking bales 6 high by yourself. You are driving a tractor from 1983. You turned down $7,000 in cash because you think your hay is worth more. And maybe it is, but there is no one here to pay what it is worth. How long do you think you can do this? Audrey looked at her son. She loved him the way you love someone who came from you, but does not understand you. The way you love a good man who measures the world in things that can be counted and filed and adjusted and depreciated, who sees a farm and calculates its value per acre instead of its value per life, who sees a barn full of hay and sees inventory instead of legacy. Your grandfather seeded that, Timothy, in 1968. He developed the curing process that made that hay what it is. I have spent 25 years refining it. That field and that process are the most valuable things on this farm, Nathan. Not because of what the land is worth per acre to a developer, because of what the hay is worth per bale to someone who knows what they are looking at. Nobody knows what they are looking at, Mom. You said it yourself. The buyer offered $350 and you sent him away. There are no horse farms in Gentry County. There are horse farms in Kentucky. Kentucky is 200 miles away. 200 miles is not the end of the world, Nathan. 200 miles is a truck ride. Your father drove further than that to buy the Farmall. Nathan did not argue further. He was not a man who argued. He was a man who adjusted, he assessed situations, calculated outcomes, filed the results, and moved on to the next claim. He drove back to Kansas City the next morning with the quiet certainty that his mother would eventually come to her senses, that the winter would be long and the bills would be heavy, and the loneliness of the farm would do what reason could not, and that by spring she would call and say she was ready to sell. He was wrong about all of it, but he was especially wrong about the loneliness. Because 2 weeks after Nathan left on a Tuesday in late October, a woman named Ellie Stratton took a wrong turn on a county road south of Albany, and the smell of properly cured Timothy hay changed everything. But before Ellie, let me tell you about how Audrey cured her hay. Because the bales sitting in that barn, the bales Hank Dobbins called a 350 product and Nathan called a burden, and the neighbors called a woman's stubbornness, were the result of a 7-step system that Russell Fenwick had developed in the 1950s and that Audrey had refined over 25 years into the most meticulous hay-curing operation in Northwest Missouri. Maybe in all of Missouri, maybe in the entire Midwest. There was no way to know because no one was ranking hay operations and no one was giving awards for curing, and no one outside of the horse community even knew that there was a difference between hay that was baled and hay that was cured. But the hay knew. The horses knew. And Audrey knew. Step 1, the cut. Audrey cut Timothy at late boot stage. This is the period just before the seed head emerges from the leaf sheath, the moment when the plant is at its nutritional peak. 12 to 14% crude protein. Digestible fiber, maximum energy per pound. The plant is holding everything it has produced over the growing season inside its stems and leaves, and it has not yet spent that energy on reproduction, on pushing out a seed head, on flowering and setting seed, and beginning the long decline toward dormancy. Boot stage is the plant's zenith. Everything after the boot stage is a slow downhill. Most hay farmers cut at full bloom or later. The yield is higher at full bloom. The plant is taller, heavier, with more stem material per acre. But the quality is lower. The protein drops to 8 or 9%. The fiber becomes less digestible. The stems thicken and harden, and the leaves begin to dry on the plant before the mower arrives, which means they shatter during cutting and baling, and the final product is stemmy and coarse and smells like straw instead of summer. Cutting at boot stage sacrificed approximately 15% of the yield for a 30% increase in feed value. Less hay, better hay. Audrey made the trade every year because she was not selling volume. She was selling excellence. And excellence in the hay market, as in every market, commanded a premium that more than compensated for the lower yield if you could find the buyer who understood what they were paying for. She cut with a 1974 New Holland 469 Haybine, a mower conditioner that cut the grass and crimped the stems in one pass. The crimping was the foundation of the entire process. The conditioner rollers, 2 rubber cylinders that rotated against each other like a clothes wringer, cracked the stem walls as the cut grass passed through, creating microscopic fractures along the length of each stem. These fractures allowed moisture to escape from the interior of the stem instead of being trapped inside the waxy outer surface that nature had designed to keep moisture in. Unconditioned hay dries from the outside in. The leaves dry first in hours because the leaves are thin and exposed to sun and wind. The stems dry last in days because the stems are thick and the waxy cuticle seals the moisture inside. The result is a drying imbalance. The leaves overdry while the stems are still wet. The overdried leaves become brittle. They shatter during raking and baling, falling off the stems and accumulating as powder in the bottom of the bale and on the barn floor and in the lungs of any horse unfortunate enough to eat what is left. Conditioned hay dries from the inside out. The cracked stems release moisture at the same rate as the leaves. The entire plant reaches baling moisture uniformly, simultaneously, every cell arriving at 14% at the same moment. Leaf retention is preserved because the leaves never overdry. The leaves stay on the stems. The nutrition stays in the bale. The money stays in the farmer's pocket. Step 2. The ted. Audrey tedded the cut hay twice, once 4 hours after cutting and again the following morning. Tedding is the process of flipping and spreading the cut hay with a rotating tedder, a machine with spinning forks that lifts the hay from the windrow, tosses it into the air, and drops it in a loose, airy layer that dries faster than a compressed windrow. Because every stem and every leaf is exposed to sun and wind instead of being buried under other stems and other leaves in the dense, wet center of the windrow, where the air does not reach and the moisture does not leave. The first ted exposed the underside of the windrow to sun and air. The grass that had been lying on the bottom, pressed against the stubble damp from the moisture of the ground and the moisture of its own weight, was lifted and flipped and spread in the light. The second Ted the next morning broke up any clumps that had formed overnight from dew absorption, because dew is the enemy of hay. The way rain is the enemy of a picnic, inevitable, predictable, and devastating if you do not plan for it and respread the hay for the final drying. Most farmers tedded once or not at all. Tedding took time. Tedding took fuel. Tedding took a pass across the field that could have been spent doing something else, something that felt more productive, something that moved the process forward instead of pausing it. But Audrey tedded twice because the second ted reduced drying time by approximately 4 hours and produced a more uniform moisture content in the final product. Uniform moisture meant uniform bale quality. No wet spots inside the bale that would develop mold. No dry spots that would shatter and produce dust. The second ted was the difference between good hay and perfect hay. And Audrey was not in the business of making good hay. She was in the business of making perfect hay and waiting for the world to notice. Step 3. The rake. Audrey raked the tedded hay into windrows for baling approximately 24 hours after cutting, when the moisture content had dropped from 70% fresh cut to approximately 18%. She used a side delivery rake, a gentle machine with rotating bars that rolled the hay into windrows without beating it, without throwing it, without subjecting it to the mechanical violence that faster rakes inflicted on dried grass. Most farmers use rotary rakes. Rotary rakes were faster. They could rake a field in half the time that a side delivery rake required. But rotary rakes were aggressive. The spinning tines hit the hay with centrifugal force, shattering dried leaves and throwing stems and reducing the leaf content of the final bale by as much as 20%. 20% of the leaves, 20% of the nutrition, 20% of the value lost to speed. Audrey's side delivery rake was slower but gentler. The leaves stayed on the stems. The stems stayed intact. The windrow that the rake produced was loose and fluffy and even ready for the next step without having been damaged by the step that got it there. Step 4. The wait. After raking, Audrey waited. She did not bale immediately. She let the windrow sit for 4 to 6 hours, drying from 18% to 14% in the afternoon sun and wind. This was the critical period. This was the window that determined everything. 14% was her target. The optimal moisture for long-term storage without mold and without brittleness. Above 16%, the hay would mold in the stack. The moisture trapped inside the bale would support the growth of aspergillus and penicillium and other fungi that produce spores that turn the hay gray and musty and dangerous to any horse that breathed them. Below 12%, the hay would be too dry. The leaves would shatter at a touch. The stems would be brittle as old bones, and the bale would produce a cloud of dust when opened that no horse owner would accept, and no horse would willingly eat. 14%, not 13, not 15, 14. The number was not arbitrary. It was the result of decades of observation by Russell and Audrey, confirmed by laboratory analysis, verified by the response of every horse that had ever eaten fennec hay. 14% was the sweet spot. The Goldilocks number, the moisture that preserved the leaves and prevented the mold and produced the smell and the color and the texture that horse people recognized as the best hay they had ever seen. She tested the moisture with a handheld probe, a $280 Delm horse meter that she had owned since 1982, when Gerald had ordered it from a farm supply catalog and given it to her for Christmas. It was not a romantic gift. It was a practical gift. It was the most useful gift she had ever received, and she had used it every cutting season for 16 years, calibrating it every spring, with a reference sample, replacing the batteries every fall, keeping it in a leather case that she had sewn herself from an old boot top, because the factory case had worn out in 1989, and Delm Horse wanted $40 for a replacement, and Audrey did not pay $40 for something she could make. She tested every 10th windrow. She walked the field with the probe in her hand, pushing the sensor into the windrow at knee height, reading the number on the dial, recording it in a small notebook that she carried in her shirt pocket. If the reading was above 15, she waited. She sat on the tailgate of the truck and watched the sky and felt the wind and waited. If the reading was below 13, she had already waited too long, and the batch was downgraded to cattle hay. Still useful, still sellable, but no longer premium, no longer horse quality, no longer worth the $15 that the horse market would pay for the real thing. The window between 13 and 15% was approximately 2 to 3 hours on a good drying day. A good drying day meant sun, wind, and low humidity temperatures at above 75. A bad drying day meant clouds, still air humidity above 60, and the constant threat of afternoon thunderstorms that could dump an inch of rain on a windrow in 15 minutes and ruin 10 hours of work. Miss the window and the hay was either too wet to store safely or too dry to sell at premium. Everything about this hay depended on hitting a 2-hour window in a process that took 24 hours to reach, and that the weather controlled more than the farmer did. And Audrey had one thing the buyer who called it 350 hay did not understand. 48 years of reading, weather watching grass, and knowing exactly when the windrow was ready. Not by the numbers on the probe alone, although the numbers mattered. By the feel of the hay in her hand. By the sound it made when she twisted a stem between her fingers. By the way the windrow looked in the afternoon light, a certain brightness, a certain looseness, a certain quality of stillness that meant the moisture was right and the time was now. Step 5. The bale. Audrey baled with a 1972 New Holland 268, a small square baler that was 26 years old, and that she maintained with the care of a woman who understood that the baler's tension settings, pickup speed, and plunger timing determined whether the bale was a $15 horse bale or a $4 cattle bale. The difference between those two prices, $11 per bale, was determined by a machine that most farmers had replaced 2 or 3 times in the same period that Audrey had owned hers. She adjusted the bale chamber tension for 45-pound bales, dense enough to hold shape during transport, but loose enough that the flakes separated cleanly when the twine was cut. Overcompressed bales, the kind that modern high-density balers produced at 200 bales per hour, packed the hay so tight that the flakes stuck together, the stems broke at the compression lines, and the leaves shattered between the layers. The bale looked impressive. It felt solid. It weighed 60 or 70 pounds, and when you opened it, it fell apart in chunks and dust instead of clean, distinct flakes, and the horse that ate it sorted through the wreckage for the pieces that were still edible and left the rest on the stall floor. Step 6. The stack. Audrey stacked the bales in the barn within 4 hours of baling. Not overnight, not the next morning, not when she got around to it. Within 4 hours. Because bales sitting in the field, even dry bales, even bales at 14%, absorb dew overnight. The surface moisture from dew creates a zone of elevated moisture on the bale's outer layer that can reach 20% by morning, wet enough for mold spores to germinate on the surface. The mold does not penetrate the bale immediately, but it stains the outer flakes gray-green and produces the musty smell that horse buyers reject on sight. One musty bale in a load of 800, and the buyer questions every bale in the load. 2 musty bales, and the buyer finds a new supplier. Audrey baled in the afternoon and stacked by evening. Every bale off the field before dark. Every bale in the barn, a dry, ventilated barn, with a gravel floor that wicked moisture away from the bottom bales and 6-foot sidewall openings and that allowed air circulation through the stack before the dew settled. The barn was not optional. The barn was not a convenience. The barn was the final stage of the curing environment, the controlled atmosphere that preserved the quality the field had created. Bales stored outside, even under tarps, developed edge mold from ground moisture and condensation under the tarp. Bales stored inside in a barn designed for airflow remained clean and dry and green and fragrant for months. Step 7. The cure. After stacking, the bales went through a 2-week curing period in the barn. During curing, the hay undergoes a final moisture equalization. The slightly wetter interior of each bale releases moisture to the drier exterior through the natural capillary action of the plant fibers in the bale reaches a uniform 12 to 13% throughout. This equalization cannot be rushed. It takes time, approximately 14 days for small square bales at Audrey's density, and during those 14 days the hay transforms. The color deepens. The bright green of fresh baling, almost lime, almost yellow-green, the color of fresh-cut grass settles into a rich, consistent green that horse buyers describe as the color of money. A deep, confident green that says this hay was made right, stored right, cured right. The color is uniform across the bale, across the stack, across the entire lot. Every bale the same shade, every flake the same hue. The consistency is the signature. The consistency says that the process was the same for every bale, that no bale was rushed or forgotten or left in the field or stored outside, that every bale received the same 7 steps in the same sequence with the same care. The smell intensifies. The sweet, clean scent of properly cured grass hay that is unmistakable to anyone who has ever opened a bale of the real thing. Not the raw, grassy smell of fresh-cut hay, which is pleasant but temporary. Not the flat, neutral smell of old hay, which is the smell of hay that has given up. The smell of cured hay is something else. It is warm and complex and layered with notes of vanilla and honey and dried flowers, and something that defies description, something that makes you stop and breathe and remember summers that you may or may not have actually lived, but that the smell makes you believe you did. That was the process. 7 steps, 48 years. And every step required patience instead of speed, care instead of volume, and the kind of knowledge that cannot be bought at a dealership or learned from a manual or downloaded from the internet. The kind of knowledge that lives in the hands and the nose and the eyes and the instinct of a person who has done the same thing 10,000 times and has paid attention every single time. Audrey stood in the barn that December evening after the Bills and after Nathan and after the silence of another day alone on a farm that the world had decided was not worth what she said it was worth. She opened a cured bale from the October stack. The flakes separated in her hands. The smell rose around her, sweet and clean and full of summer, a smell that had no business existing in a Missouri December, but existed anyway because the hay remembered the field even when the field was frozen. She held a flake to her face and breathed. She was not going to sell, not the hay, not the land, not the process, not the barn, not the memory of Gerald falling in the second cutting with the probe in his hand reading 14.2. Not the memory of Russell walking her to the field at 14 and putting a rake handle in her hands and saying, "This is how we do it. We do it right or we do not do it at all." She was not going to sell. And then on a Tuesday in late October, a pickup truck pulled into the lane. It was not Hank Dobbins. It was not Nathan. It was a woman in a blue Ford Dully with Kentucky plates and a horse trailer hitch on the back. A woman who had taken a wrong turn somewhere south of Albany on the county roads that were not on most maps. The kind of wrong turn that a GPS would have prevented, but that 1998 road atlases could not, because the roads in Gentry County were barely roads at all. They were gravel and dirt and grass and memory roads that the county graded twice a year, and that the rain washed out 3 times a year, and that the farmers drove because they had always driven them, and because the farms were where the farms were, and the roads went where the roads went, and no one had ever seen a reason to put them on a map. Ellie Stratton was 44 years old. She managed a show-jumping barn in Lexington, Kentucky. Stratton Equestrian, 12 stalls, 6 competition horses, worth between $40,000 and $200,000 each. Horses with registered names that sounded like poetry, and pedigrees that stretched back generations, and veterinary files thicker than the phone book. Horses that traveled to competitions in climate-controlled trailers and ate specially formulated grain and received chiropractic adjustments and acupuncture and dental work and the kind of medical attention that most humans would envy. These horses ate 25 pounds of hay per day, each. 6 horses, 150 pounds per day, 1,050 pounds per week, over 50,000 pounds per year. 6,000 bales. The hay was not a side dish. The hay was the foundation of the nutritional program, the base layer upon which every grain supplement and every vitamin and every calorie calculation was built. Bad hay undermined everything. Good hay supported everything. Great hay that was clean and nutritious and free of dust and mold and contaminants. Great hay made the difference between a horse that performed at 90% and a horse that performed at 100%, and in show jumping, where a single rail down or a fraction of a second on the clock separated first place from 10th, the difference between 90 and 100% was the difference between a career and a hobby. Ellie was driving from Omaha to Lexington after a regional show jumping competition. She had left the interstate to avoid construction near Kansas City and had taken state highways south through northwest Missouri, and somewhere south of Maryville, the state highway had turned into a county road, and the county road had turned into a gravel road, and the gravel road had ended at a T intersection with no sign and no indication of which direction led back to civilization and which direction led deeper into a landscape of hayfields and cattle pastures and farmsteads that looked like they had been there for 100 years and would be there for 100 more. She pulled into the Fenwick farm to ask for directions. The barn door was open. Audrey was inside stacking second cutting Timothy. 800 bales freshly cured. 2 weeks in the barn, the moisture equalized, the color deepened, the smell intensified. The smell reached the driveway before Ellie reached the barn. It came through the open door of her truck like a greeting. It came across 30 yards of gravel and through the cool October air, and it stopped her the way a voice stops you when someone calls your name in a place where you did not expect to hear it. Ellie got out of the truck. She did not walk to the house to ask for directions. She did not look for a doorbell or a person or a sign that said, office or welcome or visitors please check in. She walked to the barn. She walked toward the smell of properly cured Timothy hay, the smell that horse people recognize, the way a sommelier recognizes a grand cru, not with the brain, but with something deeper, something that lives in the memory of every hour spent in a barn, every morning spent filling hay nets, every afternoon spent watching a horse lower its head into a flake and breathe before it eats, testing the hay with its nose before committing its mouth. Because horses are careful eaters, discriminating eaters, and the first thing they judge is the smell. Ellie stood in the barn doorway. The light was behind her. The hay was in front of her. The smell surrounded her. She did not speak for a long moment. Is that Timothy? Audrey looked up from the stack. A stranger in the barn doorway. Kentucky plates on the truck outside. Pure stand. Second cutting. 14% moisture. Cured 2 weeks. Can I see a bale? Audrey climbed down from the stack. She pulled a bale from the third row, not the top where the bales were newest, and not the bottom where the bales had borne the weight of the stack for 2 weeks. The third row where the bales were representative of the lot, where the curing was complete and the quality was average. She cut the twine. The flakes separated cleanly, bright green, leaf-rich, the stems soft and flexible. No dust, not a particle. Ellie took a flake. She held it in both hands the way you hold something that might be fragile or might be precious, or might be both. She turned it in the light. She ran a thumb across the surface and felt the leaves intact, soft, papery, clinging to the stems. She bent a stem between her fingers, and it bent without breaking a smooth arc like a willow branch. The kind of flexibility that meant the hay was alive in the structural sense, still holding its plant, architecture still capable of delivering nutrition without creating dust or waste. She held the flake to her face and breathed. Clean, sweet, no mold, no must, no ammonia, no dust, no off notes of any kind. Just the pure, warm, complex scent of grass that had been cut at the right time and dried at the right speed and stored at the right moisture and cured for the right duration. The hay that horse people dream about and almost never find, because most hay farmers do not know how to make it, and most hay farmers who do know how to make it do not know how to sell it, and most hay farmers who know how to make it and sell it do not have the patience to do every step right every time. Ellie looked at Audrey. Audrey looked at Ellie. 2 women standing in a barn full of hay, one who had made it and one who knew what it was worth, and between them the unspoken recognition that what was in this barn was not ordinary. What was in this barn was exceptional. What was in this barn was the product of 48 years of knowledge and 7 steps of care in a 2-hour moisture window, and the stubbornness of a woman who had been told her hay was trash and had not believed it. How much I have been offered? $3.50 from the local buyer. $3.50. Ellie said the number the way you say a word in a foreign language that does not translate correctly. $3.50 for this hay. $3.50. Ellie shook her head. She shook it the way a person shakes their head when they have found something they were not looking for in a place where they were not looking, and cannot believe that it exists, and cannot believe that no one else has found it, and cannot believe that the person who made it does not know what it is worth. This is the best Timothy I have seen outside the Shenandoah Valley. I manage a show barn in Lexington. I buy 6,000 bales a year. I pay $12 to $14 a bale for hay that is half this quality from growers in central Kentucky who cannot keep the leaves on because they overdry in the summer heat, and they bale at 18%. And they use rotary rakes that shatter everything, and they store outside under tarps that leak, and the hay arrives at my barn smelling like rain and looking like straw, and my horses sort through it like children picking the vegetables out of a casserole. She held the flake up. For this quality, this leaf retention, this color, this moisture, this smell, this texture, I would pay $15, maybe 16. My horses are worth $40,000 to $200,000 each. They eat 25 pounds of hay per day. The hay is their primary nutrition. Their primary nutrition, not the grain, not the supplements, not the electrolytes. The hay. Bad hay makes sick horses. Good hay makes healthy horses. Great hay makes champions. This is great hay. $15. Audrey heard the number. She heard it in the barn where her father had stacked hay in 1968, the first year of the Timothy stand, the first year of the pure planting, the first year of the process. She heard it in the barn where Gerald had stacked hay until the day he fell in the second cutting with the probe in his hand. She heard it in the barn where she had stacked hay alone for 12 years, where she had opened bales in December and breathed the smell of summer and refused to sell because the price was wrong. $15 was not wrong. $15 was right. $15 was what the hay was worth, what the process was worth, what 48 years of care was worth. $15 was the market recognizing the craft. I can deliver 2,000 bales to Lexington, Audrey said. 200 miles. I would need to arrange a trucker. I will send my truck. I have a 53-foot van trailer that holds 800 bales. 3 loads. I will pay freight, $15 per bale. The freight is about $1.20 per bale on an 800-bale load. I am paying $16.20 delivered for hay that is worth every penny. Every penny, Audrey. My horses will tell me if it is not, and I guarantee you they will not complain about this hay. The deal was made in the barn doorway. No contract, no negotiation, no lawyers, no paperwork, no 30-day terms, no purchase orders, no invoices in triplicate. A handshake between a woman who knew how to cure hay and a woman who knew how to recognize it. A handshake that was worth more than any contract because it was built on something that contracts cannot create: mutual recognition of quality in the trust that comes from standing in the same barn and breathing the same hay and understanding the same truth. 2,000 bales at $15 per bale, $30,000. Hank Dobbins's offer for the same 2,000 bales, $7,000. The difference, $23,000, was the difference between knowing what hay looks like and knowing what hay is, between measuring the outside and measuring the inside, between the buyer who sees a bale and the buyer who sees what the bale contains. Audrey paid the loan that month. She paid the insurance. She paid the property tax. She paid the feed bill. She had money left over for the first time in 3 years. Not because she had more hay, not because she had worked harder, not because the weather had been better, or the field had been more productive, or the costs had been lower, because she had found a buyer who measured what was inside the bale instead of measuring the bale itself. That evening, after Ellie drove away with directions to the interstate and a handshake agreement for 2,000 bales, Audrey sat on the porch of the farmhouse. The October evening was cool and still. The barn was visible from the porch, the white barn, with the green roof, the hay elevator against the south wall, the door still open from the afternoon. The smell of cured Timothy drifted across the yard in the twilight, mixing with the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke from the neighbor's chimney a mile to the west. She thought about Russell, who had seeded the Timothy and built the barn and developed the process and taught her everything she knew about grass and weather and patience. She thought about Gerald, who had refined the process and maintained the equipment and fallen in the field with the probe reading 14.2. She thought about Hank Dobbins, who had measured the outside. She thought about Ellie Stratton, who had measured the inside. And she understood, in the way you understand something that you have always known but never had to say aloud, that the hay had never been the problem. The buyer had been the problem, and now the buyer had changed, and the farm was going to survive, and the process was going to continue. And the Timothy was going to grow in the spring and be cut in the summer and be cured in the barn and be shipped to Kentucky in the fall, and the horses were going to eat it and thrive, and the money was going to flow back to Albany, and the bills were going to be paid, and the life that Russell had started and Gerald had continued and Audrey had preserved was going to go on. She sat on the porch until the stars came out. She did not go inside until the barn was dark and the smell of hay was the only thing left in the yard, sweet and clean and permanent. The first truck from Lexington arrived on a Thursday morning in early November. A 53-foot van trailer, white with Stratton Equestrian painted on the side in dark green letters, pulling into the gravel lane of a 160-acre hay farm in Gentry County, Missouri, the way an ocean liner pulls into a river port, conspicuous, foreign, and impossible to ignore. The neighbors saw it. They all saw it. A horse farm trailer from Kentucky at the Fenwick place. The woman who turned down $350 was loading hay for Kentucky. The driver's name was Ray. He was a quiet man with hands the size of dinner plates who had been hauling hay for Ellie Stratton for 6 years, and who had in those 6 years loaded bales from 12 different farms in 3 states without ever commenting on the quality of the product. Hay was hay. He loaded it, he strapped it, he drove it. The horses ate it, or they did not. That was not his department. Ray walked into the Fenwick barn and stopped. He stood in the doorway the way Ellie had stood in the doorway 2 weeks earlier. He breathed the way she had breathed. He looked at the stacked 2,000 bales in rows 6 high, the green faces of the bales visible between the twine, the color uniform and deep and rich, the smell filling the barn from floor to rafters. And then he said the only thing he said all day. This is different. Audrey loaded 800 bales onto the trailer with the Farmall 560 and the hay elevator, the same elevator Gerald had welded to the tractor's 3-point hitch in 1980, the same elevator that had lifted 100,000 bales over 18 years. The bales went up the elevator and into the trailer in rows stacked tight but not crushed, each one placed by hand because Audrey would not allow a bale to be thrown. Thrown bales landed on their edges. Edges compressed. Compressed edges shattered leaves. Shattered leaves meant lost nutrition and lost money and lost reputation. One thrown bale was one bale that arrived in Lexington with a damaged corner and a dusting of leaf fragments in the twine, and a horse owner who opened it and saw imperfection where she expected perfection. Every bale was placed, the way every windrow was tested, the way every cutting was timed, the way every step in the process was executed, not with the urgency of a woman trying to get the job done, but with the precision of a woman who understood that the job was not done until it was done right. One careless moment, one thrown bale, one crushed edge, one shattered leaf, and the chain of quality that started in the field was broken. The horse at the other end of the chain would know. The horse always knew. Horses are honest evaluators. They cannot be fooled by appearance or marketing or price. They eat the hay or they do not. They breathe it in and their lungs accept it or reject it. The horse is the final inspector, and the horse's standards are higher than any human's. 800 bales took 5 hours. Ray watched her work. He did not offer to help because he could see that she did not want help. She wanted control. She wanted every bale handled the way she handled every windrow and every flake and every stem, with the precision of someone who understood that quality was cumulative, that it was the sum of 1,000 small decisions, and that one bad decision could undo 100 good ones. The trailer pulled away in the afternoon. Audrey stood in the lane and watched it go 800 bales of her hay, her curing her 48 years of knowledge, rolling east toward Kentucky at 55 miles an hour in a trailer that smelled like the best summer Missouri had ever produced. She stood there until the trailer was out of sight, until the dust had settled on the gravel, until the only evidence that the truck had been there was the tire tracks in the lane and the empty space in the barn where 800 bales had been. Ray came back twice more. 2,400 bales total, plus the remaining 800 from the second cutting. 2,000 bales at $15. $30,000 wired to Audrey's account at the Gentry County Savings Bank in 3 installments over 3 weeks. The bank manager called her. He did not usually call customers about deposits, but $30,000 from a horse farm in Lexington, Kentucky, deposited into an account that had been averaging $400 a month for 3 years. That was unusual enough to warrant a phone call. Audrey, is everything all right? Everything is fine, Walter. I sold some hay. The hay arrived in Lexington in the same condition it left the barn. Green leafy fragrant. Ellie opened the first bale in front of her barn manager, a man named Drew who had been feeding horses for 20 years and who had seen every grade of hay from premium to garbage and who looked at the Fenwick Timothy the way a jeweler looks at an uncut diamond that might be flawless with hope, with skepticism, and with the trained eye of a professional who has been disappointed before. Drew was not disappointed. The horses ate it without sorting, without wasting, without the coughing and head shaking that inferior hay caused in the two mares with respiratory sensitivity. Horses are particular about hay the way cats are particular about everything. A horse will eat around bad hay. It will pick through the stems and leave the dust. It will turn its head away from a flake that smells wrong and stand hungry rather than eat something that offends it. A horse will tell you the truth about your hay before any laboratory can, and the truth it tells is binary good or not good acceptable or unacceptable, eat or refuse. These horses did not pick. They did not sort. They did not cough. They lowered their heads into the Fenwick hay and ate the way horses eat when the hay is exactly what hay should be, steadily, calmly, with the deep rhythmic chewing. That means the animal is content and the food is right, and the world for this moment is exactly as it should be. Ellie called Audrey in December. My vet bills for respiratory issues dropped 40% this month. 40%. I switched 6 horses to your hay, and 4 of them stopped coughing within 2 weeks. The mare that has been on bronchodilators since last spring, she has not needed a treatment since November. My vet pulled a hay sample and tested it. No mold spores above detection threshold. Dust particle count below 100 per gram. He said it is the cleanest Timothy he has ever tested. He asked where I got it. I told him Missouri. He did not believe me. It is not medicine, Audrey said. It is hay that was made right. Audrey, I want everything you can produce next year. First cutting and second cutting, all of it. I will pay 15 per bale. I will send Ray with the trailer whenever you are ready. And I have 2 colleagues who need to know about your hay. A dressage barn in Versailles and a breeding operation in Paris. They are both struggling with hay quality. They both need what you have. The second year, 1999, Audrey cut 2,400 bales across 2 cuttings. She pushed the first cutting earlier by 3 days, catching the boot stage at its absolute peak, and she pushed the second cutting later by a week, waiting for a stretch of warm, dry weather in August that produced ideal drying conditions. Ellie took all 2,400 bales at $15. Revenue $36,000. Ray made 3 trips in July and 2 in August. The white trailer with Stratton Equestrian on the side became a regular sight on the county road, rolling past the farms that grew cattle hay for $3.50 and the farmers who had shaken their heads about the Fenwick woman and her horse hay delusion. Except it was not a delusion anymore. It was a bank balance. It was a loan paid in full and an insurance premium current and a feed bill covered and money in the account for the first time since Gerald died. It was not wealth. It was solvency. And solvency for a woman who had been stacking bales alone for 12 years on a farm that the world had decided was not worth saving was worth more than wealth. Solvency was vindication. The third year, 2000, Audrey pushed production to 2,800 bales. She added a third cutting in September, a risky cut because September moisture was unpredictable in northwest Missouri, and the drying window was shorter as the days grew cooler and the nights grew longer, and the dew arrived earlier and stayed later, and the 2-hour window between 13 and 15% became a 90-minute window or even an hour. But Audrey read the weather the way she read the windrows, with 48 years of accumulated knowledge, with the instinct that comes from paying attention to the same sky over the same field for half a century. She waited for the right week, warm, dry, with steady wind from the southwest, and she cut 600 bales of September Timothy that cured darker and sweeter than the summer cuttings because the cooler nights concentrated the sugars in the grass, and the shorter days slowed the plant's metabolism, and the hay that resulted was denser in flavor and deeper in color and more aromatic than anything the summer had produced. Ellie paid $15 for the September hay and called it the best of the 3 cuttings. Her horses agreed. The September hay disappeared from the feeders faster than the July or August hay. The horses chose it first. They always chose it first. Revenue that year, $42,000. Audrey's days had taken on a rhythm that she had not known since Gerald was alive. The rhythm of a farm that was working, a farm that was paying its way, a farm that justified the effort and the solitude and the 6 o'clock mornings and the 8 o'clock evenings, in the body that ached in new places every year, but that still got out of bed and still walked to the barn and still did the work. She woke at 5. She checked the weather on the radio, the AM station out of St. Joseph that gave the agricultural forecast at 5:15, the temperature and humidity and wind speed and precipitation probability that determined whether today was a cutting day or a tedding day or a waiting day or a day when the hay sat in the barn and cured while Audrey repaired fence or fed cattle or sharpened the mower blades or greased the tedder bearings or did any of the 100 other tasks that a farm demands and that a woman alone on a farm does without help and without complaint. She walked the Timothy field once before breakfast, not to inspect but to listen. The grass talked if you knew how to hear it. The sound of Timothy in the wind changes as the plant matures, a soft whisper at early growth when the stems are thin and the leaves are small, and the whole plant bends in the breeze like a choir of green. A fuller rustle at boot stage when the stems have thickened and the leaves have broadened and the plant is dense with stored energy and the wind moves through it with a sound like water over stones. A dry rattle at full bloom when the seed heads have emerged and the stems have hardened and the leaves have begun their decline and the plant is past its peak and heading toward dormancy. Audrey listened for the rustle. The rustle meant the boot stage was approaching. The boot stage meant the cut was coming, and the cut meant the 7 steps were about to begin again. She ate breakfast at the kitchen table where the bills used to pile up. The bills did not pile up anymore. The table held a coffee cup, the dumb horse moisture probe, and the notebook where she tracked each cutting date, weather moisture readings at 2-hour intervals, bale count quality assessment on a 1 to 10 scale that only Audrey used and that only Audrey understood. The notebook was the record of the process, 30 years of entries in 2 handwritings. Russell's neat block letters through 1982, the entries growing shakier in his final years as his hands stiffened with arthritis, and Audrey's tighter, more deliberate script from 1983 onward, the handwriting of a woman who recorded facts and not feelings, because facts were what the hay needed and feelings were what she kept for the porch in the evening. Ellie referred 2 other farms, a dressage barn in Versailles, Kentucky, operated by a woman named Margaret Hollis, who trained warm-blood horses for Grand Prix competition, massive, elegant animals that moved like dancers and ate like athletes and whose nutritional needs were as specific and demanding as the movements they performed in the ring, and a thoroughbred breeding operation in Paris, Kentucky, run by a family named Braddock, who stood 2 stallions and foaled 30 mares a year, and whose veterinarian had told them that the respiratory issues in their yearling barn were caused by moldy hay from their current supplier. Both farms sent representatives to Albany. Both walked into the Fenwick barn and stood in the doorway the way everyone stood in that doorway, breathing, recognizing, understanding. Both pulled bales from the stack and opened them and held flakes to their faces and breathed and shook their heads and said variations of the same thing that Ellie had said. "This is the best Timothy I have seen." "How much?" "Where have you been?" Both placed orders. 2001, 3,200 bales for Ellie at $15. 1,200 bales for the Versailles and Paris farms at $14, the lower price reflecting the fact that these were new accounts, and Audrey believed in earning loyalty before charging top dollar. You give a new customer a reason to stay. You give them a price that demonstrates confidence in your product. You do not gouge them on the first order. You let the hay speak for itself, and when the hay has spoken, when the horses have eaten it and thrived, and the vet bills have dropped, and the barn manager has called and said, "This is the best hay we have ever fed," then you raise the price to what it is worth, and the customer pays because the customer now understands what they are buying. Total revenue, $64,800. Audrey Fenwick's 160-acre Timothy field was now producing more revenue per acre than any corn or soybean farm in Gentry County. $405 per acre in gross hay revenue versus the county average of $280 per acre for row crops. And Audrey's input costs were a fraction of a row crop operation. No seed the Timothy was perennial, coming back every spring from the same root system that Russell had planted 3 decades earlier. No herbicide, the pure stand, and the border mowing kept the weeds out. No insecticide. Timothy is not a target crop for most agricultural pests. No GPS planting system, no satellite-guided sprayer, no precision agriculture technology that cost $50,000 and required a software subscription. Just composted manure mowing and the 7-step curing process that turned a $4 commodity into a $15 craft product. The curing was the value, and the value was growing. But value does not grow in silence. Value draws attention. And attention in a county where hay had always been hay and a dollar had always been a dollar, and a woman alone on a farm had always been a problem, waiting to resolve itself, drew Hank Dobbins back to the Fenwick farm. He came in the fall of 2000. He pulled into the lane behind the Stratton equestrian trailer and same white 53-footer Ray at the wheel, 800 bales going east to Kentucky. Hank sat in his truck and watched the loading through his windshield, the engine idling, the diesel fumes mixing with the hay smell that drifted from the barn. He watched Audrey on the farm all lifting bales with the hay elevator, placing each one in the trailer with the care of a woman handling something precious. He watched Ray strap the load and close the trailer doors and pull away the truck's air brakes, hissing as it started down the gravel lane toward the county road and the highway and the 200 miles of interstate between Albany, Missouri and Lexington, Kentucky. Hank got out of his truck. He walked to the barn. Audrey was inside, sweeping the floor where the loaded bales had been because she swept after every loading to keep the barn clean for the next stack. The floor needed to be clean because the bottom bales sat on the gravel floor, and any debris on the floor, old hay leaf fragments, dirt tracked in by boots, would hold moisture against the bottom bales and create the conditions for mold. Cleanliness was not neatness. Cleanliness was quality control. Cleanliness was another step in the process, an unofficial 8th step that Audrey performed, not because Russell had taught her, but because she had learned it herself from 20 years of observation, from the one time in 1984 when she had not swept and the bottom row of bales had developed edge mold, and she had downgraded 40 bales to cattle hay and lost $600 and never failed to sweep again. That is a horse farm truck. Lexington, Kentucky. How much are they paying? 15 a bale. The number hung in the barn air the way the hay smell hung, heavy, undeniable, impossible to ignore. Hank had been buying hay for 20 years. He had never heard $15 for a small square bale of grass hay. He had heard $4. He had heard $5. On a good day when the market was tight and the supply was short, he had heard $6. But 15. 15 was not a hay price. 15 was a specialty product price. 15 was the price of something that had been transformed from a commodity into something else, something that the commodity market did not recognize and could not explain and would never pay. 15 a bale. I offered you $3.50. You offered me $3.50 because you were buying cattle hay. Ellie is buying horse hay. Same bale, different buyer, different value. The bale did not change Hank. The buyer did. 15 a bale for Timothy. I have been buying Timothy for $3.50 for 20 years. You have been buying Timothy that was cut at full bloom, baled at 18%, stored outside and fed to cattle. I have been growing Timothy that is cut at boot stage, cured to 14%, stored inside and good enough for a $200,000 show horse. The difference is the curing. The curing is the value. You did not see the value because you were measuring the bale. Ellie measures what is inside the bale. Hank stood in the barn. He stood in the smell of cured Timothy, the sweet, clean scent that filled the space from floor to rafters. He stood in the spot where 2 years earlier he had cut a twine and opened a bale and offered $3.50 and walked away thinking that the woman was foolish and the hay was ordinary and the price was the price. The woman was not foolish. The hay was not ordinary. And the price, it turned out, was whatever the right buyer was willing to pay. Hank left without speaking, but he did not leave without thinking. And what he thought about through the winter of 2000 and into the spring of 2001 was not that Audrey was right and he was wrong. What he thought about was that there was money in the horse hay market and that he, Hank Dobbins, who had been buying and selling hay for 20 years, who knew every farm in 4 counties, who had a truck and a trailer and a Rolodex full of contacts, ought to be getting some of it. If Audrey could sell Timothy for $15, then surely someone who understood the business, the logistics, the volume, the customer relationships could sell Timothy for 10 or 12 and still make 3 times the cattle rate and still undercut Audrey's price and still capture the horse market that she had found by accident when a woman from Kentucky took a wrong turn on a county road. By summer, Hank had organized 3 farmers in Nottoway County into what he called a cooperative. They would grow Timothy or what they called Timothy, because the fields were mixed stands with fescue and orchard grass and clover and whatever else had seeded in over the years, fields that had not been pure stands since the day they were planted, and that would never be pure stands because the farmers had never invested in the border mowing and the overseeding and the 30 years of maintenance that a pure Timothy stand required. They would bale it with modern equipment and sell it to horse farms at $8 to $9 per bale, below Audrey's price, below the Kentucky market rate. A discount product for the horse market, sold on price instead of quality, on volume instead of craft. Hank found a buyer, a show barn in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, that was paying $12 per bale from a local grower and was willing to switch to a cheaper supplier. Price was the argument. Price was always Hank's argument. He sold hay the way he bought hay, on price, on quantity, on the external dimensions that told you nothing about the inside. Hank delivered 400 bales in July. The hay was green-ish. The leaves were present, mostly. The moisture was acceptable, probably. The bales were dense, modern, high-density balers, 200 bales per hour, the kind that crushed leaves between flakes and produced tight, heavy blocks that looked impressive on a trailer and felt solid in the hand and weighed 65 pounds instead of 45 and seemed like a better deal because you were getting more hay per bale, more material per dollar, more weight per unit, which was exactly the wrong way to measure horse hay, but exactly the right way to measure cattle hay. And that was the problem. Hank was measuring horse hay with cattle hay metrics, and the metrics did not translate. The hay looked like hay. It smelled like hay. But it was not the hay that Audrey made. It was not cut at boot stage. It was cut at full bloom 2 weeks past peak, when the yield was higher but the protein was lower, and the stems were thick and coarse, and the leaves had already begun to dry on the standing plant. It was not tedded twice. It was tedded once briefly, a quick pass with a high-speed tedder that flipped the windrow but did not fluff it, that moved the hay but did not separate it, that looked like tedding, but was not tedding in the way that Audrey tedded, which was slow and thorough and designed to expose every stem to sun and every leaf to air. It was not raked with a side delivery. It was raked with a rotary, fast and aggressive, the tines shattering leaves across the windrow in a haze of green dust that looked like a flaw in the machine, but was actually a flaw in the method. It was not baled at 14%, it was baled at 18 because the farmers did not own a moisture probe. And Hank told them 18 was fine because 18 was what he had been buying for 20 years. And 18 had never been a problem because his customers were cattle, and cattle do not complain about moisture. 18 was fine for cattle, 18 was not fine for horses. The Cedar Rapids barn fed the hay to 12 horses. Within 2 weeks, 3 developed coughs, dry, persistent coughs that started after feeding and lasted for an hour, the kind of cough that horse owners dread because it means something in the hay is irritating the respiratory tract. Within a month, 1 mare was diagnosed with Heve's chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, the equine equivalent of emphysema triggered by mold spores and dust in the hay. The veterinarian pulled a sample from the interior of a bale and cultured it. Aspergillus mold, growing between the flakes where the moisture had been 18% at baling and had not dried below 16 in storage because the bales had been stored in a shed without ventilation, stacked tight on a concrete floor that wicked cold and held condensation. The exterior of the bale had been dry. The exterior had looked fine. The exterior had fooled Hank and the farmers and the barn manager in Cedar Rapids because the exterior was what they measured and the interior was what they ignored. The mold was inside. The quality failure was inside. The truth of the hay was inside, and no one had looked inside until the horses started coughing. The Cedar Rapids barn called Ellie Stratton. Horse people know horse people. The network is small and the memory is long, and the consequences of bad hay are serious enough that every barn manager keeps a mental list of reliable suppliers and shares that list freely because the health of the horses matters more than any competitive advantage that hoarding a supplier's name might provide. The barn manager asked Ellie for a recommendation, and Ellie gave them one name: Audrey Fenwick, Albany, Missouri, the best cured Timothy in the Midwest. Tell her Ellie sent you. The Cedar Rapids barn called Audrey. They ordered 600 bales at $14. They never bought from Hank Dobbins again. And they told other barns. Not that Hank sold bad hay that would have been forgivable, because everyone sells bad hay occasionally because the weather is unpredictable and the moisture is variable and mistakes happen. What they told other barns was worse. Hank sold hay that looked like good hay but was not. He sold the appearance of quality without the substance. He sold the outside of the bale without caring about the inside. And in the horse world, where the health of animals worth tens of thousands of dollars depended on what they ate, the appearance of quality without substance was not a business failure. It was a betrayal of trust that the market would not forget. Word traveled the way word always travels in the horse world, not through advertisements or trade magazines or cold calls, but through barns. Through trainers leaning on fence rails at competitions talking about hay, the way they talked about farriers and veterinarians in the thousand small decisions that separated a healthy horse from a sick one. The Cedar Rapids barn told two other barns in Iowa. Those barns told a trainer in Illinois. The trainer in Illinois called Ellie, and Ellie said the same thing she always said when someone asked about hay. Audrey Fenwick, Albany, Missouri, the best cured Timothy in the Midwest. The name was becoming a brand. Not because Audrey marketed it, she did not advertise, did not attend trade shows, did not have a website or a business card or a logo. She did not have a marketing plan or a sales strategy or a social media presence. The brand was the hay. The hay was the marketing. Every bale that arrived in a horse barn and smelled like summer and fed horses that stopped coughing and started performing best was an advertisement that no amount of money could have produced and no competitor could duplicate without the 7 steps and the 48 years of knowledge behind them. Hank's cooperative dissolved by September. The 3 farmers went back to selling cattle hay at market rate. The horse market, they decided, was too demanding, too picky, too much trouble for hay. You had to cut at the right time and dry at the right speed and test the moisture and control the density and store inside and wait 2 weeks, and then the buyer opened the bale and smelled it and checked the color and bent the stems and counted the leaves, and if any of it was wrong, the buyer said no, and you hauled the hay home and sold it for $4 to the feedlot and lost money on the freight. What they meant was that the horse market required care, and care was something they had never been asked to provide and did not know how to supply. The cattle market had trained them to value speed and volume. Cut fast, bale fast, sell fast. The hay was a product of the calendar, not the craft. If it rained on the windrow, you baled it anyway, and the cattle ate it anyway, and the check came anyway, and you moved on to the next field. The horse market did not work that way. The horse market punished every shortcut with rejection and rewarded every extra step with loyalty. The cattle market forgave carelessness. The horse market remembered it. And the horse market had a memory that lasted years, that spread through barns and competitions and phone calls that followed a supplier's name, the way a credit report follows a debtor permanently, accurately, without forgiveness. Audrey knew. She had always known. And the market was rewarding her knowledge the way markets reward anyone who provides what others cannot, with loyalty, with referrals, with prices that reflected the true value of the product instead of the commodity floor, and with the kind of reputation that money cannot buy and competition cannot erode, and time does not diminish. That same year, Dale Prescott walked into the Fenwick barn. Dale ran the John Deere dealership in Albany. He sold balers, mower conditioners, tedders, and rakes, the equipment that makes hay. He had been trying to sell Audrey a new baler for 15 years, the way he tried to sell every farmer, a new baler with brochures and financing terms and fuel efficiency comparisons, and the quiet implication that anyone still using equipment from the Nixon administration was falling behind the times and the market and the neighbors who had already upgraded. Audrey, the 268 bales, 80 bales per hour. My new JD 348 bales, 200 per hour. You could bale your whole field in half the time, half the fuel, half the labor, twice the productivity. I do not want half the time, Dale. I want twice the quality. The 348 has adjustable density. At its lowest setting, the 348 compresses harder than my 268 at its highest. The 348 was designed for production, maximum bales per hour, maximum throughput, minimum time in the field. My 268 was designed for quality, maximum leaf retention per bale. I sell quality, Dale. You sell speed. Those are not the same market. You are making $72,000 a year on hay with a 1972 baler. I am making $72,000 a year because of the 1972 baler. The baler is part of the system Dale. The cut, the TED, the rake, the moisture, the bale density, the storage. Every step produces the quality that the horse market pays for. Change one step switch to a faster, harder baler, and the quality drops. The leaf retention drops. The flake separation drops. The horse buyers notice. They always notice because they are feeding $200,000 animals, and $200,000 animals deserve hay that was made with care instead of speed. Dale left without a sale. He had been selling hay equipment for 20 years. He had sold dozens of balers to farmers who measured productivity in bales per hour, the way Hank measured hay in bales per ton. Speed and weight, speed and weight. The metrics of the commodity market, the numbers that mattered when the product was undifferentiated, when one bale was the same as every other bale, when the buyer did not open the bale, or smell it, or check the leaves, or bend the stems. Audrey measured productivity differently. She measured it in dollars per bale. And at $15 per bale, her 80 bales per hour New Holland 268 produced more revenue per hour than any 200 bales per hour modern baler in the county. 80 bales per hour at $15, $1,200 per hour, 200 bales per hour at $4, $800 per hour. The slower baler earned more because the slower baler made better hay. Speed is not productivity. Quality is productivity. And quality in hay, as in everything, is the product of care, not pace. The product of attention, not efficiency. The product of a woman who had been doing the same thing for 48 years and who had paid attention every single time, and who understood that the machine was not the answer to the question the market was asking. The market was not asking how fast can you bale. The market was asking how good is the bale. Nathan had been standing near the barn door during the conversation with Dale. He had driven up from Kansas City that morning to help Audrey replace a bearing on the farmall, one of the rare occasions when she accepted his help because the bearing required two people and a hydraulic press, and even Audrey could not hold a shaft and press a bearing simultaneously. Nathan had heard the exchange. He had heard his mother explain the mathematics of quality versus speed to a man who sold machines for a living. He had heard her say that the baler was part of the system and that the system was the value, and that the value was not in the machine, but in the knowledge of how to use it. He had watched Dale leave without a sale the way Hank had left without a purchase, the way every person who tried to change Audrey's process left empty-handed, slightly confused, and unable to argue with the results. He did not say anything that day, but something shifted in him. Something that had been locked in the insurance adjuster part of his brain, the part that calculated value per acre and return on investment and depreciation schedules and replacement costs, and the 100 other metrics that his profession used to assign numbers to things loosened slightly, and a different calculation began to form. Not value per acre, value per bale, not return on investment, return on care. He watched his mother walk Dale to his truck. He watched her stand in the lane until the truck disappeared around the bend. He watched her turn back to the barn, to the hay, to the work that she had been doing alone for 19 years, with a machine from 1972 and a process from the 1950s, in a stubbornness that he had spent his entire adult life trying to talk her out of. She was right. She had been right the whole time. And every person who had told her she was wrong, Hank Dobbins, the neighbors, the bank manager, the developer who wanted the land, and Nathan himself, Bothan, who had sat at the kitchen table and suggested she sell and move to Kansas City and stop doing this, had been measuring the wrong thing. They had been measuring the farm by the standards of the commodity market. Audrey had been measuring the hay by the standards of the craft. The craft paid more. The craft always pays more because the craft produces something that the commodity cannot: quality, consistency, reputation, and the kind of value that survives a price comparison because it exists in a category where price is the least important measure, and the most important measures are the ones you can smell and see and feel in the palm of your hand. He did not understand it yet, not fully. That understanding would come later in a barn in a season he did not expect, when he would hold a flake of Timothy hay to his face and breathe, and finally understand what his mother had been telling him for 38 years, without words, through the hay itself, through the 7 steps, through the smell of summer, in a Missouri December. By 2003, Audrey was supplying 5 horse farms in the Lexington area. Total annual production had reached 4,800 bales on 3 cuttings from 160 acres. Total annual revenue, approximately $72,000, $450 per acre. The county average for row crops that year was $310 per acre. Audrey was out-earning every corn and soybean farmer in 3 counties. On hay, on Timothy, on the crop that the commodity market valued least and the horse market valued most. On the crop that Hank Dobbins had been buying for $350 for 20 years. On the crop that the neighbors had shaken their heads about. On the crop that grew from the same roots that Russell had planted in 1968 and that Audrey had tended every year since, alone after Gerald died, alone after Nathan left alone with the grass and the weather and the process and the patience that the craft required. And then she did something that surprised the neighbors more than the horse farm trucks or the Kentucky money or the refusal to buy a new Baller. She started teaching. Between 2001 and 2005, Audrey helped 3 neighboring farmers convert their hay operations from cattle grade to horse grade. She taught them the boot stage cut. She taught them the double TED. She taught them the gentle rake, the 14% window, the density-controlled bale, the 4-hour stack, and the 2-week cure. She taught them everything she knew, everything Russell had known, everything that 48 years and 7 steps had produced. She lent them her moisture probe. The Delmhorst meter she had owned since 1982, the instrument that was the gatekeeper of the entire process, the tool that told you whether the hay was ready or whether you needed to wait or whether you had already waited too long. She drove to their farms on baling days. She stood in their fields and watched them test windrows. She told them when the readings were right and when the readings were wrong and why the difference between 14% and 16% was the difference between a $15 bale and a $4 bale. She showed them how to open a bale and read its quality by color, by leaf, by smell, and by texture, the 4 qualities that no instrument could measure, but that every horse buyer evaluated, and that determined whether the buyer said yes or no, and whether the truck from Kentucky made a second trip. She did not charge for the teaching. She did not ask for a percentage of their sales. She did not require them to sell through her or brand their hay with her name or sign a non-compete agreement. She taught because teaching was what Russell had done for her and what Gerald had done beside her and what the 7-step process demanded, not secrecy, but stewardship. The process was not Audrey's property. It was Russell's creation refined by Audrey, and it belonged to anyone who had the field, the patience, and the willingness to treat hay as a craft instead of a chore. Some of the other farmers' wives asked her why. Why teach competitors? Why share the process that made your hay worth 4 times the market rate? Why give away the advantage that you spent 48 years building? Audrey's answer was simple. The horse market is bigger than one farm. Ellie's referrals alone bring more demand than I can fill. If my neighbors can produce horse-quality hay, the whole area benefits. We become known for Timothy. We become the source. A source is stronger than a single supplier. A source is a reputation that belongs to a place, not just a person. And when I am done, when my back gives out, or my hands give out, or the weather beats me, one season too many, the source will still be here, and the process will still be here, and the Timothy will still be growing because I taught someone else how to do it. 2 of the 3 farmers achieved horse quality within 2 seasons. Their hay was not quite Audrey's. The leaf retention was slightly lower, the color not quite as deep, the smell not quite as intense. The difference was subtle. It was the difference between a 90 and a 95, between very good and excellent, between hay that horse buyers accepted with satisfaction and hay that horse buyers accepted with gratitude. But it was close enough for the mid-tier horse market, the barns that did not compete at the highest levels, the barns that owned horses worth 10 to 20,000 instead of 200,000, the barns that wanted good hay and would pay for good hay but did not require the absolute best. Each of the 2 successful farms added approximately $28,000 per year in revenue by switching from cattle hay at $350 to horse hay at $12 to $14 per bale. The lower price reflected their inexperience, but the premium over cattle hay was still enormous, $28,000. From the same field, the same grass, the same season. The only difference was the process. The 3rd farmer could not make the transition. His fields had too many weeds. The Timothy stand was not pure enough for the horse market. Fescue and clover and orchard grass mixed in with the Timothy and the mixed species cured at different rates. The fescue drying faster, the clover drying slower, the orchard grass somewhere in between, and the result was bales with uneven moisture. Wet spots next to dry spots, mold next to dust. The kind of quality inconsistency that horse buyers detected immediately and rejected without appeal. Audrey told him the truth. You cannot cure your way out of a bad field. The quality starts in the ground. It starts with the seed in the stand and the 30 years of maintenance that a pure Timothy field requires. If the field is wrong, the process cannot save it. By 2005, the Albany area of Gentry County was shipping approximately 14,000 bales of horse-quality Timothy to Kentucky, Iowa, and Illinois horse farms annually. 3 farms, 14,000 bales. Total revenue from the horse hay trade, approximately $196,000. Total revenue if the same hay had been sold as cattle hay, approximately $49,000. The horse market premium, $147,000 per year, was flowing into 3 farms in northwest Missouri because one woman had developed a 7-step curing process that turned a commodity into a craft. One woman who had been told her hay was trash. One woman who had been told to sell the land. One woman who had been told to retire. One woman who had refused all 3 and whose refusal had created not just a business but a network, not just a product but a standard, not just a revenue stream but a legacy that was already spreading beyond her fence lines and beyond her county and into the wider world of the American horse industry, where the name Fenwick was becoming synonymous with Timothy. The way certain names in wine country are synonymous with Cabernet, or certain names in bourbon country are synonymous with whiskey. The name meant quality. The name meant trust. The name meant that the bale you were buying had been made with care by someone who understood what care meant and why it mattered. The hay buyer who called it trash drove past the Fenwick farm every week. He watched the horse farm trucks load hay that he had dismissed. He watched the neighbors who had shaken their heads about the Fenwick woman loading their own hay onto their own trucks for their own horse farm accounts. He watched the world prove him wrong, one bale at a time, one truck at a time, one season at a time. The hay had not changed. The buyer had changed. And the woman who understood the difference between making hay and curing hay had been out-earning the cattle market for 7 years on 160 acres of grass in a 7-step process in a baler from 1972. But the years were not done with Audrey Fenwick. The years had one more lesson to teach, not to her, but through her. And it would come in the season she least expected in the barn she had built her life around, on a day when the hay smelled like summer, and her body reminded her that even the most careful hands eventually need someone else to carry what they have made. It happened in August of 2005. The second cutting was in the barn, 800 bales stacked 6 high the way Audrey had stacked them every summer for 37 years. The hay was curing 3 days into the 2-week equalization, the moisture settling from 14% at baling to the final 12 or 13% that produced the color and the smell and the quality that Ellie Stratton's horses had been eating for 7 years. The barn smelled like every August, warm and sweet and green, the smell of a season compressed into 2,000 bales and held there by the process in the barn and the patience that the cure required. Audrey was on the top row. 6 bales high is approximately 12 feet, and at 12 feet the barn floor is not visible below you, just the tops of the lower rows, the grid of twine and hay and shadow that looks solid from above, but is not solid at all. It is bales balanced on bales held in place by friction and weight in the geometry of the stack, which Audrey understood intuitively because she had been building stacks for 48 years, and she knew how the bales interlocked and how the weight distributed and where the weak points were and where you could step and where you could not. She was placing the last bale of the row, a 45-pound bale lifted from the elevator, carried across the top of the stack and both arms positioned at the end of the line. She had done this 10,000 times. She had done it alone for 19 years since Gerald died. She had done it at 50 and at 55 and at 60 and at 62 and at 65 and at 68. And every year the muscles said the same thing: we are still here. We can still do this. We are not finished. And every year she believed them because they had never lied. They lied that August. The bale was in her hands. Her right foot was on the edge of the sixth row where the bale met air and the stack ended. Her left foot was on the fifth row one step behind, planted on what she thought was solid. But the bale beneath her left foot was not solid. A bale in the fifth row had shifted during stacking a quarter-inch of lean invisible from below, undetectable from above. The kind of imperfection that happens once in 10,000 bales. And that does not matter until someone is standing on top of it, 12 feet in the air, with 45 pounds of hay in her arms and her balance distributed between 2 feet on two bales that were supposed to be level and were not. Her balance went the way balance goes when you are 69 years old and 12 feet in the air and holding 45 pounds and your left foot is a quarter-inch lower than your right foot, and your body compensates for the tilt by shifting weight, and your weight shifts to the wrong side, and the bale in your arms becomes a pendulum, and the pendulum swings and you swing with it, and the world tilts, and there is a moment, a single clear crystalline moment, when you know you are falling and there is nothing you can do about it. She fell, not off the stack sideways across the top of the fifth row, her back striking the edge of a bale in the fourth row. The corner of the bale, the hard square corner where the plunger had compressed the hay into a right angle, hit her lower back at the junction of the fourth and fifth lumbar vertebrae. Her body folded over the corner the way a body should not fold, the spine bending around a fixed point with 45 pounds of momentum and the full weight of a 69-year-old woman who had been lifting bales since she was 14. The pain was immediate, not sharp, not dull, bright. The kind of pain that fills your vision and turns the world white for a moment and makes you forget where you are and why you are there and whether you are alive or not, and then the world comes back slowly in pieces, the rafters above you, the hay beneath you, the smell of cured Timothy surrounding you, like a blanket that is trying to comfort you, but cannot, because comfort requires a body that is not on fire, and your body is on fire from the waist down. She lay there for 20 minutes. No one came because no one was there. No one was ever there. That was the arithmetic of a woman alone on a farm, the arithmetic that Nathan had been calculating for years, the sum that always came out the same. One person, 160 acres, one barn, one stack, one fall, and no one to hear the sound of 45 pounds hitting the hay, and the smaller, worse sound of a body hitting the bale edge, and the silence that followed the silence that filled the barn, the way the hay smell filled the barn completely, without mercy, without regard for the woman lying on top of the fifth row, with her legs over one side and her arms over the other, and the August light slanting through the sidewall openings and falling on her face like a spotlight on a stage where something terrible has happened. Audrey got herself down. She does not talk about how, and no one who knows her asks. She crawled along the top of the fifth row to the end of the stack, where the bales stepped down like stairs, 6 high to 5 high, to 4 high, to 3, to 2, to 1. She lowered herself one row at a time, each descent a negotiation between her will and her spine. Each row a victory that cost more than the last. Her arms shook. Her legs shook. The bright pain in her back bloomed with every movement, white to red to white, again, a rhythm that matched her pulse. She reached the barn floor. She crossed the barn on her hands and knees, past the farmall, past the hay elevator, past the open door where the evening light was turning gold. She reached the house. She reached the couch. She lay down and did not get up. The doctor in Albany said 2 compressed vertebrae and a herniated disc. 6 weeks of rest, no lifting, no baling, no stacking, no climbing, no driving the farmall, no operating the hay elevator. No doing any of the things that had defined her life for 48 years and that her body had done without complaint until this August afternoon when it finally said no. 6 weeks. It was August. The second cutting was cured and ready to load. Ellie's truck was scheduled for the first week of September. 800 bales. The third cutting needed to happen in late September if the weather held another 400 to 600 bales. 4,800 bales committed to 5 horse farms across Kentucky, Iowa, and Illinois. $72,000 in revenue. The reputation of 7 years and the livelihood of 3 farms that depended on the Albany hay network that Audrey had built. And Audrey Fenwick could not lift a bale, could not walk to the barn without pain, could not sit in a tractor seat for more than 10 minutes without the bright, white pain returning and the world narrowing to a single point of light in agony. She called Nathan. She had never called Nathan for help. Not when Gerald died and she had finished the second cutting alone the same week. Not when the tractor broke down in the middle of baling and she had rebuilt the hydraulic pump in the barn with a manual and a socket set and 3 trips to the parts store in Albany. Not when the barn roof leaked in the ice storm of '94 and she had climbed to the peak in January with a tarp and a hammer and nailed the tarp over the leak while the wind tried to peel her off the ridge like a stamp off an envelope. Not when the bank called about the loan. Not once in 19 years had she called her son and said the words that she said that August evening, sitting on the porch with the phone in her hand and the barn visible across the yard, and the pain pulsing in her back like a clock counting down. I need you to come home. 4 words. The hardest 4 words she had ever spoken. Harder than telling Gerald's mother that Gerald was gone. Harder than telling Nathan that the farm was in trouble. Harder than telling Hank Dobbins that his price was wrong. Because these 4 words were an admission of something that Audrey had spent 69 years refusing to admit, that she could not do it alone. That the body that had carried her through 48 seasons of hay and 12 years of solitude in 6 rows of bales stacked 12 feet high had reached a limit that willpower could not overcome and stubbornness could not deny. Nathan drove from Kansas City that night. 3 hours on the interstate, the last 30 minutes on the county roads in the dark, the headlights finding the gravel lane and the mailbox with Fenwick in Gerald's faded paint and the farmhouse with the porch light on and the barn beyond it dark. The door closed, the hay inside curing in silence. He arrived at 11. He found his mother on the couch with ice on her back and the bills on the kitchen table and the moisture probe on the counter next to the phone, as if she had placed it there deliberately, as if she had been holding it when she called and set it down to pick up the receiver and left it there as a message. The probe was the message. The Delm horse meter she had owned since 1982. Gerald's Christmas gift. The gatekeeper, the instrument that told you whether the hay was ready. She had placed it on the counter where Nathan would see it, and Nathan saw it, and he understood what she was asking without her having to ask. He called his office the next morning. He told his supervisor he was taking family leave. His supervisor asked how long. Nathan said he did not know. There was a silence on the line, the professional silence of a man in a climate-controlled office trying to calculate the liability of an employee who was leaving to stack hay for his mother in a barn in northwest Missouri. Nathan did not explain. He was beginning to understand that some things could not be explained in a phone call. Some things had to be felt in the muscles and smelled in the barn and measured with a probe on a 2-hour timeline. Some things had to be lived before they could be understood. He did not go back to Kansas City for 6 weeks. The first task was the September loading. 800 bales from the second cutting, cured and ready stacked 6 high in the barn. Ray was coming with the trailer in 10 days. Nathan had to load the bales onto wagons, transport them to the loading area, and stack them in the trailer. 800 bales at 45 pounds each. 36,000 pounds of hay, moved by hand and by elevator, and by the farmall, 560 that Nathan had not driven since he was 18 years old, and that he now drove the way you drive, something that belongs to someone else, carefully, slowly aware that every scratch and every dent was a mark on something that his mother loved and that his father had bought and that his grandfather's farm had required. The hay elevator worked the way it had always worked, lifting bales from the wagon to the trailer in a steady mechanical rhythm that had not changed since Gerald welded it to the 3-point hitch in 1980. The rhythm was Gerald's rhythm. The angle was Gerald's angle. The speed was Gerald's speed. Nathan was operating a machine that his father had designed and built and used, and that his mother had maintained, and the machine did not care who was running it. The machine did the work. The person did the caring. Nathan loaded the 800 bales in 2 days. His back ached in places he did not know he had. His hands were raw, the skin peeled back at the base of each finger where the bale twine had dug in and pulled and abraded. His shoulders felt like someone had driven railroad spikes through them from above. He understood for the first time what his mother had been doing alone for 19 years. And the understanding was not intellectual. It was not a number on a spreadsheet. It was not a calculation or an adjustment or a claim filed and assessed. It was physical. It lived in his muscles the way the pain lived in hers. It was the kind of understanding that only comes from doing the work yourself, from feeling the weight of the bale in your arms, and The pull of the twine on your hands and the ache in your back at the end of a 10-hour day and knowing that tomorrow you will do it again. Ray arrived on schedule. He walked into the barn and looked at the loaded trailer and looked at Nathan, this man in his late 30s with the soft hands and the Kansas City haircut and the blisters that said he had been doing something he was not accustomed to doing, and said the second thing he had ever said at the Fenwick farm. "Your mother taught you well. My mother has not taught me anything yet," Nathan said. "This is just loading." The teaching came next, the third cutting. Late September 2005, Audrey could not cut, Ted could not rake, could not bale, could not stack. She could sit on the porch. She could watch the field through binoculars. She could hold the moisture probe and the thermometer and the radio that connected to the weather station in St. Joseph. She could talk, and Nathan could listen. He cut the Timothy on a Monday. Late boot stage, the period Audrey described as the moment before the seed head shows itself, when the plant is holding its breath, full of protein and sugar, and the energy of a season compressed into a few inches of green stem. He cut with the New Holland 469, the mower conditioner that was 31 years old, and that ran the way all well-maintained machines run reliably, stubbornly, with the quiet competence of something that has done its job 10,000 times and does not need to be reminded how. 4 hours after cutting, he tedded. The first ted flipping the windrow to expose the underside to sun and air. Audrey watched from the porch 200 yards away, binoculars in her lap, radio in her hand. She called him when she saw him moving too fast. "Slow down. The tedder forks are catching clumps. You are tearing leaves off the stems. I can see the green dust from here. Slow down and the forks will lift clean." He slowed down. The forks lifted clean. The leaf dust stopped. The next morning, the second ted, breaking up the overnight dew clumps, respreading the hay in a loose, airy layer. Audrey watched. Audrey called. "The northeast corner is thicker than the rest. The windrow was heavier there because the land slopes and the mower cuts deeper on the downhill. Go over it twice. The moisture will be uneven if you leave it." He went over it twice. 24 hours after cutting, he raked. The side delivery rake, gentle, slow, rolling the hay into windrows without beating it. Nathan wanted to use the rotary rake. The rotary rake was faster. The sky to the west was showing clouds. Thin, high clouds that might mean rain in 48 hours or might mean nothing. The kind of clouds that required the sky reading skills that Audrey had developed over 48 years and that Nathan had not developed at all. Audrey said no. The rotary rake will shatter the leaves. Use the side delivery. The clouds will hold until Thursday. Trust me, I've been reading that sky for 48 years. Those are mare's tails. They mean a front is coming, but not today and not tomorrow. Thursday at the earliest. You have time. He used the side delivery. The clouds held until Thursday. It rained Thursday night long after the hay was baled and stacked and the barn doors were closed. The rain fell on the empty field and on the stubble and on the gravel lane, and Nathan stood on the porch and listened to it and understood that his mother had read the sky correctly, the way she read the windrow correctly, the way she read the moisture correctly, the way she read everything correctly, because she had been paying attention for 48 years, and the sky, and the grass, and the weather had been her teachers, and she had been their student, and the education was complete, but the lessons never ended. Then the wait. The windrows sat in the afternoon sun, drying from 18% toward 14. Nathan drove the farmall to the field every 30 minutes with the Delmhorst probe testing every 10th windrow, reading the numbers, calling them to Audrey on the radio. 16.2, wait. 15.8, wait. 15.1. Almost. Check again in 20 minutes. And check the east windrows separately. They are in the shadow of the tree line after 3 o'clock. They will be a point higher than the west side. He checked. They were a point higher. He baled the west windrows first and came back for the east windrows 40 minutes later when the shadow had shifted and the moisture had dropped. 14.7. Now. Bale now, Nathan. You have 2 hours before it drops below 13. Do not stop for water. Do not stop for fuel. Do not stop for anything. Bale everything in the field before the window closes. Nathan baled 80 bales per hour on the New Holland 268, the machine that was 33 years old and that Audrey had maintained with new knotter bills and fresh shear pins and the tension setting marked with a greased pencil line on the spring, The Fenwick setting the setting that produced 45-pound bales at the density that preserved the leaves. The machine clattered and thumped and nodded and ejected bale after bale, the rhythm mechanical, but the outcome human, each bale a product of the windrow's moisture, the chamber's tension, the pickup speed, and Nathan's decisions about when to slow on the thick sections and when to speed on the thin ones. Decisions his mother made by instinct, he made by radio. And slowly, bale by bale, the instinct began to form in him too. Not as knowledge, as feel. The feel of a bale coming off the chamber at the right density. The feel of twine at the right tension. The feel of a windrow that is ready. He baled for 3 hours, 240 bales. He stacked them in the barn before dark within 4 hours of baling every bale off the field before the dew. Every bale in the barn where the air circulated, and the gravel floor wicked moisture, and the curing could begin. His back ached in places that connected to the places that had ached yesterday, a continuous landscape of soreness from shoulders to knees. His hands were blistered in new places. Deeper blisters, the blisters of a man who had gripped a steering wheel, and a moisture probe, and a bale hook for 10 hours without stopping. He opened a bale the next morning. The flakes separated. The color was green, not as deep as Audrey's best, not the color of money yet, but green. The leaves were present, mostly intact, a few shattered along the edges, where the pickup had been aggressive on a turn. The smell was there, not as intense as a cured bale, but the foundation was right. Audrey was on the porch. Nathan brought the open bale to her. He set it on the porch railing and pulled a flake and held it out. She took it in both hands. She turned it in the morning light. She bent a stem. She counted the leaves on a 6-inch section. She held it to her face and breathed. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "You missed the early windrows, the ones on the east side of the field. They dropped below 13 before you got to them. I could hear the baler from here, and the sound changed on the east side. The bales were harder, drier, more compression. Those bales will be brittle, cattle grade." Nathan nodded. He had known. He had felt it in the bales as he stacked them, the slight crunch under his hands, the way the leaves broke, instead of bending, the absence of the softness that distinguished horse hay from cattle hay. How many? About 40. Out of 240, 83% horse quality on your first solo cut. That is better than either of the neighbors managed in their first season. They were at 70%. You are at 83. It was not praise, it was assessment. Audrey did not give praise for hay. She gave assessment the way her father Russell had given assessment, the way the moisture probe gave assessment accurately without emotion, measuring what was there instead of what you hoped was there. But Nathan heard something in it that was not measurement. He heard something that sounded like the beginning of trust. He did the second batch 3 days later. This time he hit the window. Every windrow between 13 and 15. Every bale at 14%. No downgrades. 200 bales horse quality, stacked by evening. He opened a bale the next morning. He carried it to the house. Audrey was in the kitchen, coffee in one hand, the radio tuned to the weather. He set the bale on the table on the spot where the bills used to pile up, where the moisture probe lived, where the notebook lay open to the page that tracked 30 years of cuttings in 2 handwritings. Audrey pulled a flake. She held it to her face. She breathed. She set it down. Your grandfather would have said the same thing he said to me the first time I hit the window on my own. He would have said, "Now you know, now the hay knows you know, and from here on it is between you and the grass." Nathan sat down at the table. He sat in the chair that Gerald had sat in and Russell before that. 3 generations at the same table in the same kitchen, in the same house that smelled like hay, because the hay was not separate from the life. The hay was the life. He understood. Not the process he had learned, the process in a week. Not the numbers he had learned, the numbers in a day. Not the economics he had known, the economics from his mother's bank statements and revenue figures in the comparison to row crop averages. He understood why his mother had refused to sell, why she had refused $350 from Hank Dobbins, why she had refused $224,000 from the developer, why she had refused to buy a new baler, why she had refused to move to Kansas City, why she had refused to retire, why she had stacked bales alone for 19 years on a back that had been aching for 10 and a body that had been aging for 69, because this smell, this color, this texture, this bale, this barn, this moment of holding something that you made with your own hands, in your own knowledge, in your own care, and knowing that it is exactly right. This was not a product. This was a legacy. This was what Russell had given to Audrey, and what Audrey was now giving to Nathan, not through words or lectures or arguments at the kitchen table, but through the hay itself. The hay was the teacher. The 7 steps were the lesson, and the smell of properly cured Timothy was the diploma. Audrey healed. Slowly, the way 69-year-old backs heal incompletely, with concessions and compromises, with mornings that started stiff and evenings that ended stiff, and a middle that was workable if she was careful, and did not twist and did not lift and did not climb and did not do any of the things that she had done every day for 48 years. She was back in the barn by October, not stacking, but supervising, not lifting, but instructing, not climbing the stack, but standing at the base and watching Nathan climb and place and balance and descend with the rhythm that she recognized, because it was her rhythm learned from her, absorbed through the hands and the back and the smell of cured hay in a barn in Gentry County. The 5 horse farms received their orders on schedule that fall. The hay was Fenwick quality, not identical to Audrey's best years. Nathan's bales were slightly less uniform, the flake separation slightly less clean, the color a shade lighter on the bales from his first batch, where the east windrows had overdried, but close enough that Ellie called and said the horses did not notice the difference. Coming from Ellie, that was the highest praise the hay could receive. The horses were the final inspectors. The horses had approved. And then in late October of 2005, Hank Dobbins pulled into the lane for the last time. Not the last time he would drive past. He still drove past every week the way he had driven past for 7 years, watching the farm that had made him wrong, watching the horse farm trucks, watching the hay that he had called trash leave the barn at $15 a bale and roll east toward Kentucky. But the last time he pulled in, the last time he got out of his truck, the last time he walked into the barn, Nathan was stacking the final bales of the season, cutting a late October cut that Audrey had attempted for the first time because the fall had been warm and dry and that Timothy had put up one more flush of growth, a gift from the weather that Audrey would not have ignored even if her back was screaming. Nathan had cut it. Nathan had tedded and raked and weighted and baled and stacked it. 300 bales horse quality curing in the barn. Hank stood in the doorway. He watched Nathan work. He watched the careful placement of each bale, the deliberate pace, the attention to the stack geometry that kept the air flowing and the weight distributed and the bales stable 6 rows high. He watched Nathan handle each bale the way Audrey handled each bale, as if it mattered. As if the bale was not just 45 pounds of dried grass, but a decision, a commitment, a declaration that this hay was not a commodity and would not be treated as one. Nathan looked up. He recognized Hank. Everyone in Gentry County recognized Hank. "Can I help you?" That Hank did not answer immediately. He stood in the smell of cured Timothy, the sweet, clean scent that filled the barn, the way it had filled the barn in 1998 when he had cut a twine and opened a bale and offered $3.50 and walked away without understanding what he was leaving behind. "I came here 7 years ago," Hank said. His voice was quieter than Nathan expected. Not the confident, flat voice of a man making an offer. The voice of a man delivering something he had been carrying for a long time and was ready to set down. "I looked at your mother's hay, and I called it a number. $3.50. I told people she was crazy. I told them no one would pay more than market for grass. I said it was just hay." He paused. He looked at the stack. He looked at the bales. He looked at the light coming through the sidewall openings, falling across the green rows and bars of golden shadow. 20 years I have been buying hay. 20 years I measured the bale. The weight, the size, the price per ton. I never once measured what was inside it. Your mother measured what was inside it from the first day I met her. She knew what I did not know and what I refused to learn. That the bale is not the product. The curing is the product. The care is the product. The 7 steps and the 2-hour window and the patience to do it right instead of fast, that is the product. That is what the horse farms pay for. That is what I missed. For 20 years, I measured the outside of the bale and missed everything that was inside it. Hank looked at Nathan. The bale did not change. I needed to change. And I did not. Not for 7 years. I still buy cattle hay. I still pay $3.50, maybe 4, maybe 5 on a good day. I still measure the bale. I still drive past this farm every week and watch the trucks from Kentucky load hay that I called trash. He stopped. He looked at the floor. He looked at the bale that Nathan had just placed on the stack. He looked at the barn that Russell had built and Gerald had maintained and Audrey had preserved, and Nathan was now filling with hay that carried the Fenwick name and the Fenwick quality and the Fenwick care. It was not trash. It was the best hay in the never trash. It was the best hay in the Midwest, and I was the wrong buyer for it. The hay did not need to change. I did. He did not ask for anything. He did not offer to buy. He did not suggest a partnership or a deal or a new arrangement that would let him participate in the horse market that he had failed to capture 4 years earlier. He said what he came to say, and he walked back to his truck, and he drove down the gravel road the way he had driven down it 7 years earlier, except that this time the man driving knew something he had not known before. He knew that the value of a thing is not in its dimensions. The value of a thing is in its making. And the making requires care, and care requires patience, and patience requires faith. And faith requires the willingness to be wrong about the price and right about the product, and to wait years if necessary for the market to find you. Nathan told Audrey what Hank had said. They were on the porch. The October evening was cool. The barn was full. The hay was curing. The smell drifted across the yard, mixing with the swirl of dry leaves and the distant sound of geese moving south over the county. Audrey did not say anything for a while. She sat in the chair that she had sat in every evening for 30 years, the wooden rocker that Gerald had bought at a church auction in Stanberry, and she rocked slowly and looked at the barn and smelled the hay and thought about Hank Dobbins standing in her barn 7 years earlier, with a bale open at his feet and a number on his lips and no understanding at all of what he was looking at. It took him 7 years, she said. It took me about 10 minutes the first time your grandfather showed me how to open a bale and breathe. She smiled. It was not a triumphant smile. It was not the smile of a woman who had been vindicated or proven right or won an argument. It was the smile of a woman who had been right for a long time and who understood that being right was not the point. The point was the hay. The point had always been the hay. Audrey Fenwick retired from active hay production in 2006 at 70 years old. Her back made the decision that her heart would not. She could no longer climb the stack. She could no longer drive the farmall for 5 hours without the pain returning. She could no longer lift 45-pound bales from the elevator to the trailer one after another 800 in a day, the way she had done for 38 years. The body had finally said what it had been whispering for a decade. Enough. You have done enough. It is time to let someone else carry it. Nathan took over. He left the insurance company in Kansas City. His supervisor asked if he was sure. Nathan said he was sure. His colleagues asked what he was going to do. Nathan said he was going to make hay. They looked at him the way people had looked at Audrey for 30 years, with the polite confusion of people who measure value in paychecks and promotions and retirement accounts and annual reviews and cannot understand why anyone would choose a barn over an office, a moisture probe over a spreadsheet, a 45-pound bale over a corner desk with a window. Nathan did not explain. There was nothing to explain that the hay would not explain better. He moved back to Albany. He moved into the farmhouse where he had grown up, the farmhouse where his grandfather Russell had planned the Timothy seating and where his father Gerald had planned the curing schedule, and where his mother Audrey had sat with the bills and the moisture probe and the notebook with 30 years of entries and the smell of hay drifting through the windows in every season. The house smelled like hay. It had always smelled like hay. Nathan had spent 18 years in Kansas City trying to replace that smell with the smell of carpet cleaner and coffee shops in the recycled air of office buildings, and now he was home, and the smell was not a memory. It was a future. Nathan uses the same curing system, the same 7 steps, the same boot stage cut, the same double TED, the same gentle rake, the same 14% window, the same density-controlled bale, the same 4-hour stack, the same 2-week cure. He bales with a newer machine, a 2001 New Holland 575, that he selected specifically because its bale chamber allows lower density bales than the John Deere models Dale Prescott pushed. He looked at 3 balers before choosing the 575. He rejected 2 because the minimum density setting was too high. The density setting on the 575 is marked with a greased pencil line on the tension spring. The Fenwick setting, the setting that preserves the leaves. The Farmall 560 that Audrey used to stack bales and load trucks is in the barn. Nathan uses it for the same work. The hay elevator on the 3-point hitch, lifting bales from the wagon to the stack 6 rows high. The same angle, the same speed, the same rhythm. The barn filling every July and August with the smell that stopped Ellie Stratton in the driveway 27 years ago. Ellie retired from training in 2010. Her successor at Stratton Equestrian still buys Fenwick hay. The van trailer still makes 3 trips to Albany every fall. The price has risen to $18 per bale inflation, plus the premium that 27 years of consistent quality has earned. 27 years. The same farm, the same field, the same process, the same family. The consistency is the brand. The consistency says that the hay you receive this October will be the same quality as the hay you received last October, and the October before that, and the October before that, stretching back 27 years to the afternoon, when Ellie stood in the barn doorway and breathed and forgot why she had stopped. Nathan's annual revenue from 160 acres of Timothy, approximately $86,400. The county average for row crops on comparable ground, approximately $340 per acre, or $54,400 on 160 acres. Nathan's hay premium over row crops $32,000 per year. From grass, from Timothy, from the crop that the commodity market values least and the horse market values most. From the crop that Hank Dobbins had been buying for $350 and selling for $4 and calling it hay. Hank Dobbins still buys cattle hay. He has never raised his offer above $5 per bale. He drives past the Fenwick farm every week. He watches the horse farm trucks load hay that he called trash in 1998. The hay has not changed. The buyer changed. And the woman who understood the difference between making hay and curing hay out-earned the cattle market for 27 years on 160 acres of grass in a 7-step process and a baler from 1972 that the John Deere dealer could never replace because the baler was not the point. The process was the point. The knowledge was the point. The 48 years of care was the point. The 1972 New Holland 268 is in the barn, retired from field work but maintained. The plunger still functional. The nodder still tying. Nathan keeps it as a backup and as a reminder, the baler that made $72,000 a year at 80 bales per hour because every bale it made was worth 4 times what a faster machine's product was worth. The baler that Dale Prescott had tried to replace and that Audrey had refused to retire because the baler was part of the system and the system was the value and the value was $72,000 on 160 acres of grass. Audrey Fenwick is 89 years old. She lives in the farmhouse. She walks to the barn on good mornings when her back allows, when the weather is warm enough and the ground is dry enough and the distance between the house and the barn feels like 40 yards instead of 400. She opens a bale from the stack. She pulls a flake. She holds it to her face. She breathes. The smell has not changed. 27 years and the smell has not changed. The sweet, clean scent of properly cured Timothy hay, made by a process that her father started in the 1950s, and she perfected in the 1980s, and her son now carries forward into a world that is faster and louder and more impatient than the world that Russell knew or Gerald knew or Audrey knew. A world that measures everything in speed and volume and efficiency and that has no metric for the thing that Audrey spent her life producing care. 3 generations of Fenwicks, 160 acres of grass, 7 steps, a 2-hour moisture window, and the patience to do it right instead of fast. The world changes, markets shift, machines get faster, corn prices rise and fall, soybean futures spike and crash. The commodity market does what the commodity market does. It measures the outside, it pays the average, it rewards volume and punishes care. But the craft market endures. The craft market pays for the inside. The craft market rewards the woman who tedded twice when once was enough, who waited for 14% when 16 was acceptable, who stacked by evening when morning was convenient, who chose the slow baler over the fast one, because the slow baler made hay that was worth holding to your face and breathing. The buyer measured the bale. The horsewoman measured what was inside it. The hay was never trash. It was the best cured Timothy in the Midwest, made by a woman who understood that the difference between $4 and $15 is 7 steps, a 2-hour window, and the hustle to accept a price that does not reflect the value of the work. $3.50 from the cattle buyer, $15 from the horse trainer. Same bale, same hay, different knowledge, different value. Because hay is not hay. Hay is either a commodity or a craft. And the farmer who treats it as a craft earns what the craftsman earns, while the farmer who treats it as a commodity earns what the commodity pays. Audrey chose the craft chose her back, and a horse farm 200 miles away paid triple.